like a butterfly flapping his wings deep down into the forest, man. It's gonna cause a tree fall like 5,000 miles away, man. There ain't nobody seeing nobody. Man, see, like, you don't even know, man. It's like you're born into this world, man. And you got like that, man. The dust and wind, man. Or like the dang old candle, man. It don't matter, man. It's all the time.
Hey guys, so this episode is a compilation of two conversations I had with Mike Ferris of the Coffee and a Mic podcast. First one about maybe 2 months ago, then another one more recently on issues of generational divide, sort of what is affecting Generation Z, and then also the war in Iran. So the audio is a little scuffed on these. It has to do with the interplay between my system and then the unique way that Mike records these. Sort of tried to remaster it, get it as good as I possibly could. But if you're wondering why I sound worse than I do right now through my system, that's why. But either way, thought I'd put that out. So be sure to check out Mike's work, Coffee and a Mic podcast. Very good, high quality stuff. He has a lot of interesting guests, put out a lot of content. So highly recommend checking out his podcast. Will be linked in the description. And yeah, these are two interviews I thought went particularly well. So without further ado, let's get into it.
Jay, we met last week, and I was on your show, and now you're on my show. I have to tell you, it feels good to be back on this side of the mic rather than being a guest.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I remember I host an interview show as well, obviously, and my first couple is probably generous. Outside appearances were rough. It is a very different skill set. And, you know, if you've only run reps on one side of the mic, all of a sudden when you're on the other, it's a much different game. You handled yourself well.
You're lying, Jay. Jay, you're lying. I was awful. You don't have to sugarcoat it. Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
But one of the really funny things is, and I've seen this with other interviewers, I think of my buddy Benjamin Boyce in particular, is that you're slippery guests. We interviewers will kind of judo throw you, and so that it becomes like, well, who's interviewing who, right? Who's talking more? Which again is sort of inside baseball stuff for listeners, but it is funny once you notice it, you can pick it up that the guys who are used to leading the interview tend to default to that in their outside appearances. Which, who knows? I may end up doing that right now that I've said.
This episode is brought to you by Vaulted, launched by McIlvaney Financial Group. The simplest and most affordable way to own physical gold and silver. Physical gold is the only asset outside of the control of the government and banking system. They can print dollars, but they can't print gold. Click on the promo link in the show notes or go to vaulted.blbvux.net/coffee and a mic. Well, it's funny because I'll tell you the story. I had a friend of mine who lived in Phoenix and he's now moved to Austin, but he had been on Joe Rogan a few times. And I used to have like all this, I felt, and maybe, I don't know if you felt this way, but when you started it, like this internal pressure of like having these notes and like doing all this research. And I was in LA. It was the 6th or 7th episode I had done. And my childhood hero is a guy by the name of Freddie Roach. I love boxing. So when I was a kid, we knew Freddie. Freddie was friends with our family. My uncle lived in Vegas. So I watched him throughout his whole career. And he eventually, if you don't know who he is, or people that are listening don't know who he is, he became a trainer, eventually trained Mickey Rourke, who was an actor, still an actor, Mike Tyson, Manny Pacquiao, had his own show on HBO about his life because he has Parkinson's. And so anyway, I was prepping for that. I was in LA, went down to the Wildcard Boxing Gym, which is at Hollywood and Vine. It's a famous boxing gym, one of the most famous in the world. And the whole day before, I was so nervous. All these notes, all this and I felt all this pressure. And after that, my friend who had been on Rogan, I said, does he have like a bunch of notes or anything? And he's like, no, I didn't see anything. Just a pad of paper and had some stuff written down. And if he got to everything, great. And if he didn't get to everything, that was okay too. And it changed my whole perspective on how I was going to handle this. And I received a compliment on, I think it was Apple Podcasts, where they said, I feel like I'm sitting in a coffee house listening to two people next to me chatting. And I was like, that's what I wanted. Like that's, so I do that habit when I'm a guest because it's just, I don't know, it's just natural. It's just like to just chat. And so one more thing I was going to add, I'm talking more on my show than I when I was a guest on your show. But also as I assess myself as a guest, and I'm happy to do that when I'm honored that people think to me to come on, but I'm not a well-versed research guy. I'm not someone that specializes like in, history or a student of history or an economist or, a geopolitical analyst or military veteran or on and on and on. I'm just somebody who's curious. Like I could never go toe to toe with you. I could never go toe to toe with Will Tanner. I mean, I learned from watching your show and I learned from speaking to you guys as a host of things I'm just curious about.
Yeah, I appreciate the compliment, man. I mean, honestly, this is a very similar, and who knows when it happened in my career. I remember the moment, I remember where I was, not necessarily the episode. But actually, I think it was Matt Williamson, the Prudentialist. And he told me this. I'd sent him an outline for the show. And he basically told me, he was like, dude, you'll be fine. You don't need that. And so it was the first one I did with no, like I had an idea of what I wanted to talk about, but no notes, no bullet points. And it was a marked improvement. And it's funny you bring up that idea of two guys talking in a coffee shop, because as I'm sure you're aware, when you're talking to someone, especially someone who hasn't done a lot of interviews, you sort of give them a little brief up front, right? All right, here's what we're doing. I'm not going to do this. This is what we're going to do. If you need anything done, just let me know. Right? They're kind of accommodating someone. And the line I always use is, the illusion I'm trying to sell is that you and I are just sitting down in a bar together, just talking. And the audience is kind of listening in. It's the same thing. It's conversational. And look, neither you nor I is on the cutting edge of podcasting. We came to it when it was still established. But I think a large part of the success of the medium is, well, there's a couple things, which is one, people have commutes, they have a lot of time, and it's a good way to imbibe information without trying to read a book at 70 miles an hour. But also, I think a big part of it is that because you can put out really as much as you want, and you're not beholden to, I guess you could say, like the overhead of a TV network, is you can give a conversation time to breathe. You can just have two people talking, batting an idea back and forth for 3 hours if you want. Okay, fair enough. Maybe every idea isn't a 3-hour idea. You compare and contrast that even to talk radio, where they're assuming that every person is tuning in 30 seconds ago. So you have to state exactly what you're talking about every segment, 3 minutes, then an ad break, over and over and over again. And look, like I certainly have good memories of bumping around country roads with my grandpa and listening to Rush Limbaugh. But fundamentally, it's a different thing. It fulfills a different niche. And I think really the explosion of podcasting is that it offers something additional, right? It offers that space for dialogue and dialectic. And one of the things that I've found really interesting, one of the reasons I found myself on the kind of nominal right, is that the combination of that medium and that general political kind of circle, and I mean that in the widest possible sense, is that it's really, in my mind, the only place that an actual dialogue, an actual conversation is happening. When you came on my show, you talked about how your work kind of had its genesis in COVID. And you saw that very, very clearly, that there was a large percentage of culture, by extension media, that was locked down. Couldn't talk at all about this one thing. But, in alternative media, for whatever alternative media means, much of it was on podcasts. Well, you can have that conversation because it short of getting, Spotify or Apple to kick you off, which takes some doing. There's some guys I know on there where it's like, I'm not saying you should be kicked off, but if you were, we're probably asking for it, right? Like the latitude is definitely there. It enabled this interesting development of like a real conversation, a real dialogue. Also, I mean, on the more kind of meta political level, I'm not a huge fan of the term woke because it's been so bastardized to the point where it means everything and nothing. But when you look at the kind of hyper aggressive political religion that takes up a large part of left-wing politics, and there is certainly one on the right as well. But it's very hard to dissent from that. You can disagree on, certain aspects of economic policy, but there are certain things you cannot. They're kind of sacred. They're kind of holy precepts. And that freezes the conversation. Like, you see that when you read these people's work, as I do. They're citing thinkers from the 60s. They're citing thinkers from the 70s, the 90s at the latest. It's the same canon. It's the same stuff. And it has been, even on the far fringes of the radical left. Look, longer than I've been alive, longer than my parents have been alive. It's a frozen conversation with very hard barriers on it. And you see that in, kind of modern media, right? I know you're a big movie guy. I think one of the main reasons why a lot of modern film feels so hollow is they're sort of jousting at windmills. They're repeating a cultural critique that may have been, really insightful, that may have been very subversive, in the Reagan administration. But now it's like, all right, come on. We've seen this before. There's been no development. There's been nothing interesting. And not to say all modern films are bad. There's certainly, quite good films that have come out recently. But nonetheless, you see that kind of conversational stagnation as it applies to art as well. That you're running over the same tropes over and over and over again. And, someone could pick up their copy of Joseph Campbell and say, oh, well, all fiction is ultimately the same story told 1,000 times, the hero with 1,000 faces. And okay, fair enough, it might be, but that's a very baseline, you could say archaic if it wasn't so negative, human narrative, right? It's something that people inherently relate to. Whereas if it's a more political narrative, it's like, well, that was a narrative for a time and a place. And when that time and place changes, look, man, like if I came on your show and I was, raging about, Cromwell and the English Civil War, like at best you'd think I was sort of eccentric. Like, whatever, who cares, right? Because, and look, like, I know there's going to be someone in the comments who's like, well, I care quite a bit. Yes, sure you do. But point is, that's not an active sort of political disagreement anymore. And that doesn't mean that, whether on the left or kind of the neocon right, there's politics happening and power happening. But from the perspective of, people like you and I who work in the space of discourse, like, what else is there to be said? And on the right, like particularly as we see with media analysis, you see the exact same. But instead of being stuck in 1964, they're stuck in 2016. There's an immense amount of money to be made by, talking about how XYZ thing is woke and bad and we hate it. It's like, yeah, sure, it probably sucks. But like at a certain point, man, like if you're running the same experiment over and over again, getting the same result, like, hey, bud, maybe it's on you. Like, stop watching it if it's really that bad. And again, you see that same kind of stuck culture. Not necessarily stuck in the same culture, but how much is there to be said on that front? It runs out. And I think that, it's part of the other reason why people are drawn to this shows and others is like, okay, well, there's a conversation to be had. There's something that's developing. You can look back, for cultural analysis at your own culture or others, or, on kind of more specific issues. And I think that's really why that space in general is, I don't know if I would say exploding yet, although it's certainly massively risen in prominence. But I think it stands to, because again, and this is both a blessing and a curse, really the only place that a conversation is actively happening.
I think it's appropriate for this conversation for people to understand who Jack Burden is and, the origin. Why did you start the show? What were you doing before?
Yeah, so I started this podcast in college, actually. A long time ago. It's now been shuttered. But there was a Discord server.
You look pretty young. Let me interrupt you. You look pretty young. How old are you?
I am 26.
Okay.
So yeah, not that young. But there was this sort of, online message board where you could, meet like-minded guys. It was not political, but it was basically like, hey, I'm in Toledo. Does anyone else want to hang out? Right. And I was at the time driving back and forth between two different cities, like 3 hours apart. Not to get too much into it, but because of COVID and other things, it had kind of a snafu with my education. And so I was stuck needed a couple credits to graduate. So I was still in school, but not very much, while also trying to hold down a job. So my education was here, job was somewhere else, traveling back and forth during the week. And so I literally got onto Google Maps, like used my phone, drew out the kind of line on the route. It's like, hey, I drive this twice a week. If anyone's along this line, let's meet up for dinner or something. Because that's what I'd do. I'd get hungry halfway through and pull off. And one of my buddies, who's still somewhat active, writes under the name Paul Fahrenheit. He was in college somewhere along that route. And he replied to the message like, yeah, hey, here's where I am. Let's grab dinner. So this guy, I don't know him from Adam, go out to a bar, have a burger. And we got into like a 4-hour argument / discussion, just going all over the place. And I had been a long-term lurker, right? I had been reading a ton, listening to a ton, kind of, watching the conversation. And this is my memory of it. It's been a couple years now. So, if he tells a different story, I don't blame him for it. But he basically was like, hey man, like you've got something to say. Like, have you ever thought about doing anything or making anything? It's like, oh shoot, I'm honestly not really. And, from that conversation, I kind of took, a month off where I was basically like, what do I want to do? Like I've written more now. I'm in a couple of magazines, I have a Substack, but it's not like my primary form of expression. But I think I'm pretty good at talking to people. So I was like, what I should do? I should have an interview show. So my first ever, it's episode 0, is me and this guy, Paul Fahrenheit, recorded in my mom's attic because I didn't have anywhere else to do it. And it was a fun conversation. And from there, it was just sort of that process of like, I want to talk to that guy. Send him an email. And it sort of kept up in that mode as kind of a secondary thing that I did, just as a hobby. I had corporate jobs. I worked in a factory, and basically it started to kind of get some traction and grow. And, I've been working in another company. We had to, part ways. And so I'm sort of stuck at this crossroads where it's like, okay, I have this thing. It's doing really well. And I could go back, get a normal job. And I was like, you know what? I think there's something to this. I think I can make a run of it. And so I just decided, like, you know what? Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. Like, let's jump in. And so far I've been, full-timer I have this timer set up on my desk to remind me, 245 days, or, roughly 6,000 hours if you care for that much detail. And yeah, so it's my full-time job. It's what I do. And so that's kind of the general origin story. As far as, becoming what I consider like a political dissident or, someone who's not on the reservation, I really had no chance at being normal. I was lucky enough to, come up through.
You had no chance of being normal.
Oh, 100%. Man.
It's funny the way you said that. The probability I'd be normal was 0.
Yeah. And so I was very, very lucky, living in a more rural area. Public schools weren't so great. And so my parents sent me to a classical Christian school. It was very much kind of based in the Western tradition. And I was lucky enough to have several male teachers there who were kind of ran the gamut from, and this is pretty common in homeschooling and private schools. They're kind of, they don't tend to be on, the reservation, so to speak. You are already selecting for people who have an alternative view on education that tends to correlate to, other alternative views. And I, have a very good memory of my friend George Bagby, who was a teacher there. And he writes, he has his own, he republishes books, and he's on my show, probably every 6 weeks or so. Very, very talented historical mind. And he was one of my teachers there. And we developed a friendship even after I graduated. He was, even as a young teenager, giving me resources, giving me books that were well beyond my ability to comprehend, but were things that were, showing me an alternative view, showing me, like, look, like there's more to human thought. There's more to politics. There's more to history than just, what you can find at a Barnes & Noble bookstand. And he introduced me to, figures like Mencius Moldbug before he ever came out as Curtis Yarvin. I was reading, Mencius Moldbug at 14, which is, again, I didn't have a chance. And when you combine that kind of, a certain natural, dissonance with, I'll be honest, a personality which is highly disagreeable. I do not like being told what to do. When I went to school and I, started at, college right after the first Trump presidency and sort of came into all of the excesses of woke campus politics. For instance, just a few anecdotes on this. We had a troop of radical vegans who would like use hammers to smash out the windows of the dining hall. I was like, I just hate you people. But more seriously, I had this sort of hellish orientation. It was 8 days before we started school, and it's burned into my memory. It was a small liberal arts school. They broke people down into all the men and all the women, and all the guys, whatever 300 of us, got put in this room with this very stereotypical left-wing political activist. She was a burly woman, blue hair, the straight across problem bangs, and like something out of a comedy sketch, she said, 1 in 3 women on college campus will be sexually assaulted. Look to your left, look to your right. One of those men is a rapist. And you're like, well, okay, man, I'm 18. I got here 45 minutes ago. This seems a little unfair. And so when you combine that kind of, initial training in non-traditional thought, you're dumped into this environment where you're seeing the kind of worst excesses of, again, in scare quotes, kind of woke politics. It's like, well, this is awful. Like, what's the alternative? Because I cannot be a part of that. Like, they won't accept me, and 2, like I don't want to live in this sort of constant cringing shame for what I am. And like a lot of people, I sort of went through what would be referred to as kind of like the IDW and the libertarian sphere, and in all of those places, I was like, well, it feels like this is a halfway. This isn't a true resistance. It's sort of to be honest, kind of a cope in between. And that's where I, kind of came back to my roots in the more what, sort of derisively referred to as the dissident right, or that kind of synthesis of, paleo-conservatism, NRX stuff, political realism. And to me, it comes down to very much that, like, well, if we accept that there is something wrong, that something is not going well, whatever it is, why ever that's the case, it's like, well, you don't want to ally yourself to that, that kind of force of entropy. And it's sort of how I ended up in the weird political circles I find myself. And then that story almost immediately dovetails with, as I said earlier, how I actually started a podcast. And look, like, I very much consider myself to be like a second or third tier figure, in the sense that, like, you have these people who are kind of first order thinkers who are writing and producing, new works. And, then you have people who are great synthesizers and analysts. And then you have popularizers, someone who can take someone who's written a book and say, all right, like, explain that in a way that a normal guy can understand. And so that's the role I sort of see myself in, not to be too grandiose, but that's sort of how I view it.
So when you started this, and congratulations, now 265 days?
246.
246.
Like, I'm not joking. I actually have a timer on my computer. And the reason I have it up is just to, when I'm being a whiny baby about things, I have to look at it and be like, okay, we haven't had a boss for this long, so shut up. It's
like Alcoholics Anonymous, man. You gotta have your gold coin.
yeah. I've got my 5-year coin for corporate America. I've been clean for this long. But you walk me past an Office Max or something, and my palms get sweaty. I start to get the old itch again.
You reminded me of something really funny. I was visiting a friend in Virginia, Reston, Virginia, last summer. And we were walking through this outdoor shopping, like, those fancy outdoor shopping. They got them all over the place. So you got the Lululemon, Apple Store, nice restaurants. Anyway, there was a company, I can't remember the name of it, but I think it was their corporate office, and they had their training room right as you're walking by with the desks and the binders. And I looked at my friend, I go, this is probably new orientation training. And for me, I just started my third year doing this, I think it was last week, full time. And I said to my friend, I said, there's no fucking way I could ever go back to that. And I kudos to people that can do it. I mean, you have to be able to roll with it in today's world, in today's climate, when you work for companies or corporations. If you're one of those people that can put your head down and just keep quiet, they don't want to hear about your opinion, and and follow the rules, God bless you. I couldn't do that anymore. And I was like, God, you got to come in there Monday morning, your first day, with this binder and have an HR person tell you, blah, 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 this. Awful. Like, all you're doing is looking at the clock and like, oh, what time is lunch? Where am I going for lunch?
Well, 100%. And, one of the other things that I think is, and this has been, there's a great piece, I can't remember who it was by, called Total Boomer Luxury Communism, which is a great name. But the point of it is sort of similar to, I think it was the Michael Savage. I'm confident on the last name, not on the first one, article that came out talking about the straits for young men in corporate America. It's very, very difficult to get into those corporate jobs. And I think that that's another reason why so many people my age are interested in alternative things, whether that's making money on the internet, starting a small business, becoming a tradesman, is because that traditional route of you go to school, you get a job, you succeed that way is, well, certainly possible, and I know people who are doing it, is much, much more difficult. It's not necessarily the safe option anymore. Like, for instance, I was talking, this came up with an elder at my church, and I basically told him, I was like, look, man, like, in my immediate social group, right, the people I see on a weekly basis, I know 2 with benefits out of a group of 15 people, and they have jobs. They're productive members of society. They're not sitting on mom's couch. But that track is much, much more difficult than it ever used to be, and we can go into why. It's maybe a different discussion. But I think that that kind of corporate job, like, if you're in it, dude, keep going. I understand it. Like, you got to support your family somehow. But I think for a lot of guys, that's simply not an option. And there's 2 reactions to that. One, which is completely understandable, which is to say, like, look, I'm getting screwed. And I'm here to tell you, yes, you are. But there's sort of a silver lining to that cloud, which is, well, you both need to do something on your own, whatever that is. And also you get to. Like, that's kind of nice. And sure, you get screwed on taxes, you don't get benefits. Like, that's not ideal. But at the same time, I think that there is a benefit to having that track closed off to you from the beginning. Because, the longer you go down that track, the harder it is to jump off of it. And again, like I've said, like, there are people for whom, their corporate job is not that kind of, miserating experience that, I experienced, that I, went through and many others did, in which case, this advice is not for you. But I do think that there is sort of a hidden blessing to that, both from, a kind of personal perspective, when you are supporting yourself fully, there's no system. You are, in a way, kind of engaging in what Kaczynski would call like the power process, in the sense that your decisions actually matter to you. It's not kind of diffused through a network. It's like, well, like, if you decide to never do another podcast again, you'll run out of money. You won't be able to have a house. You won't be able to eat. And like, yeah, sure, the same thing kind of happens with a real job. But like, when I talk to many of my friends, or what few of my friends, I should say, who have the kind of, big company job, their responsibility is very diffused. It's very difficult to say, and this is by design, right, who is to blame for really anything. And so as long as you're not an astonishingly bad employee, as long as you don't, come in and, stand on your boss's desks and, give him both fingers, you can pretty much coast. and again, like their restructurings and all that. Whereas that luxury is not afforded to most people who are out on their own. And again, like there's an element of responsibility to that, but as we understand, with that responsibility comes an immense sense of fulfillment, right? You're getting to affect your own life one way or another. And, Kaczynski, perhaps, most infamous for his performance art, quite an interesting philosopher. And, he talks about that in, industrial society and its future, that basically, you have people who are designed to live, in a subsistence setting where every one of your decisions is life or death. And, he was sort of an anarcho-primitivist, so he had a different view of society than I do. But fundamentally, this piece of analysis stands. And what he says is that as systems get more and more complicated, as your individual actions get further and further from the inputs that affect your life, people get really dissatisfied. They feel as if, my life is pointless. My decisions don't have a huge impact. And again, there is both a positive and negative to that. You can succeed vastly above how you could in a, kind of salaried position, but also you don't have that social safety net. And so I guess my general perspective on that is like, I see guys lamenting that, and I understand it. Like they have been given a raw deal, but I think there's a certain advantage as well, which is that like with that comes a certain sense of like genuine freedom that you couldn't get otherwise. Forgive me if I'm rambling, Mike.
No, not at all. Do you feel in your own situation, and correct me here, is there a disconnect between people your age and say the boomers? Because, and before you answer that, not all boomers, before I get all the hate in the shit, but I'm sure there are some that'll come to you and say, well, that was how life was like when I was your age. And I'm so tired of hearing that from people. I even have friends, my age that have kids that are maybe a little bit younger than you. And one is specifically with his daughters. And he was like telling us, well, get a corporate job, you get insurance, blah, 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 blah. And she don't want to do it. And he goes, well, I had to do it. I was like, yeah, but the times have changed. And that's where I try. I mean, I'm not your age, so I don't understand. I try to be as good of a listener as I can be to grasp, get a little bit of a grasp of what it is like for you and what you're going through. But, how is there a disconnect between, say, my parents' age, 60s and 70s, when they try to speak with people like you?
Oh, 100%. So the problem is, so there's a conflation often made between the boomers' relative wealth and the idea that they had it easy throughout their entire life. These are not one and the same. So, for instance, the average boomer, I believe, has about 65 to 70% of their net worth in their home. They have on paper, they're worth a lot, but they don't necessarily have a ton of cash in the bank. And if you look at, those sort of valuations, that really shot up in the last 20 years. So you have a lot of people who, are doing quite well, but realistically, like that is a relatively new thing in their lives. I think of my own grandparents who were working class. My grandfather was a mechanic, basically. And yeah, sure, like if he cashed his house out, he'd have a lot of money. But, throughout his entire life, he was a working class guy. He made a good job. He worked hard, but by no means was he a rich man. So I get that. And so I understand the reaction of like, well, that's not what I saw. But to be honest, the problem is, and this is both due to currency debasement and many other factors, young people are just really poor, man. And they're not necessarily just poor when it comes to assets, right? What they're, actually able to, hold. But also compensation is, relatively speaking, very, very down. You can compare this, and my Peruvian bull on Twitter, Ricardo Rios, has done some great analysis on this, comparing effectively average compensation to gold, just as kind of a broad brush of like, assuming this is a relatively constant value. And just on the compensation level, it's been disastrous. Every subsequent generation has, in real terms, earned less. And at the same time, assets, so whether that's housing, whether that's automobiles, have gone up dramatically. So for instance, and it's been a while, so the numbers are going to be slightly inexact here. I did a very simple calculation where I compared average, like the true median wage to a certain number of different major purchases, right? So for instance, I chose the mid 60s just because it made this relatively convenient. If you go slightly further back, it's even more pronounced. But basically, a house was about, approximately 4 times median wage. Okay. Whereas now it's about 9. So that means it is significantly harder to buy a house. Cars are not quite as bad, but they're pretty close. Like you have a roughly 15% of median wage. To buy a used car in the 60s, it's now about 33%. So even those smaller financially responsible decisions are much, much harder to make. And this is setting aside what I mentioned earlier, which is getting a normal job. How relatively difficult is that? Thanks to the wonders of the borderless labor market, it has gotten much harder. We saw this first, generations ago, hit, manufacturing, obviously construction. It is now starting to hit those good 6-figure laptop jobs. Programming is a great one. And so, yeah, things have dramatically changed. One of the other ones that I don't think a lot of boomers appreciate, and I was talking to my grandfather about this. He's a great guy. We have an awesome relationship, and he bucks many of the trends.
Is he supportive of what you're doing?
By his generation.
Is he supportive of what you're doing?
Yes. I mean, kind of. I don't 100. And if you listen to this, Grandpa, I'm sorry. I don't 100% think he gets it, not in the content, just in the format. Yeah. Right? It's radio versus digital.
My sister doesn't get it, in my view. Like she doesn't understand what it like. She doesn't understand our world. But I don't mean to cut you off, but I also find like most people in the 8 to 5 world don't grasp it. Like I had a neighbor said to me, he's like, "Oh, you don't work," so. And I'm like, and I'm not going to be like, say, "Oh, I work all the time." I mean, people don't understand. You do. I understand what you go through. I mean, somewhat, because we work all the time. Like,
oh yeah. Well, I mean, look, I quit my job to work like 60 hours a week, and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem like that math doesn't add up. The psychological benefits are more than just the hours work, but he can get the economic stuff because he lived through it. Like he saw normal working class jobs go away. He's seen, the cost of these things go up. But there's a secondary level that is harder to track, which is the complete and total disillusion of culture. Now, there's a purely demographic element to this. Generation Z, my generation, is the first majority minority age block. So that's created kind of a dissolution of culture. But also, like on a very fundamental level, the relations between the sexes have just exploded, detonated. So I'm married, right? So this isn't my experience, but when I, even my friends, my family members going through it, the war between the sexes that previous generations spoke about actually exists in Generation Z. And a large part of this is there's a huge gap between, shall we say, stated and revealed preference when it comes to these kind of luxury beliefs, right? Views about, how men and women should interact. And so to pick on the baby boomers a little bit, if you ask that entire generation, which is a number of people, their views on certain things, they will tell you one thing, but if you actually dig into how they lived their lives, they lived like their parents did. Okay, maybe they got one divorce in the 80s, but generally that second marriage had a much better chance of surviving than a second marriage would nowadays. And so, but those progressive values that many of them held, well, the next generation may have actually put it into effect. And so what you see with Generation Z, and look, our parents are Gen X. They're not boomers. Boomers are either our grandparents or aunts and uncles. So oftentimes that term boomer is basically just used to mean anyone older than me. So it's inexact. But we were largely educated by millennials, in many cases, older millennials, some Gen Xers, who took many of those particularly, feminist or other kind of, culturally left-wing beliefs, and they actually meant them. They didn't just say it. They actually did it. And so that same experience that I had in college with that Rubenesque feminist, to use a polite term, guys got just slammed by it. I was lucky to be in college by the time that came around. But if you're 12, 13, 14, or if you were in a more progressive area where that stuff was more, acceptable, you've been getting just like bombarded with that your entire life. Similarly, like, in the post-Me Too era, right? Both on an institutional level and also on a cultural level, relations between men and women changed dramatically. Certain things that were deemed to be appropriate or even, within the kind of normal scope were not only rendered inappropriate, but you could lose your entire life if you hit a tripwire. And again, I'm a religious extremist, so this wasn't my experience, but like, if you hook up with a girl and 3 weeks later she doesn't like it, tells the wrong person, your life is ruined. You have an article, as what happened to, the Duke lacrosse team has happened at many other institutions. You're now an internationally known rapist. Sorry to use a term that you'll probably have to bleep. But that had
you can say that word. Is that a bad word to say?
I mean, yes, it is, but also like it was literally what happened. I'm not an advocate for that. Point is, sorry.
So you don't have to, but I wouldn't believe it anyway. But like, what's funny? I'm cutting you off here for a second. I had my friend Mary Bowden on, and I don't know if you follow her, Mary Tally Bowden, and she, we were talking about how when she was on Danny Jones's podcast last year with Jack Cruz and Callie Means, and they had to bleep out. There's certain words they had to bleep out for YouTube, which you talk about medical freedom. So I don't need to tell you what those words are.
Yeah.
And I said to her, it's so funny to me because I grew up as a kid, the R-rated movies when they would be on regular TV, because I grew up in front of the television. And so these R-rated movies, I couldn't watch them on cable because they were uncensored. And they would delete the sex scenes, and then all the swearing, they would either mute it or they do some lousy dubbing of it. But yet she's on a show, and they didn't even have her on the picture of the thumbnail. They didn't want to have her. They didn't want to take a chance of that. And then I think, if memory serves me, Danny Jones or his production team or whatever had to go over it with YouTube to make sure it was all up and up before they even published it for the public.
That's crazy. Like, genuinely, that's crazy. It's incredibly irritating. But I know exactly what you mean. I'm the world's worst editor. So I will, take notes on the side of like, oh, I probably got to take that out, and invariably forget it. And so, look, sometimes you are directly quoting someone, even someone you would disagree with. It is their words, not yours. And still, YouTube or others will sort of punish you for it. It's gotten worse in the era of AI. But
have you had any challenges with YouTube recently?
No, I actually. My ability to keep stuff monetized is almost impressive. A part of it is developing a code of euphemisms to say whatever you want. Like if you could say whatever you want as long as you approach it in the right way. And if you're not saying like slurs, calls to violence, which I wouldn't do anyway, you can talk around almost anything. But I did have one. Actually, this was crazy. This was for, again, alternative medical hypotheses. And the thing that I got clipped for is I was, as a joke, describing the tinfoil hat stuff. Like kind of playing a character for a little bit, talking to a guy, Eugippius, who's a very, very talented researcher on this. And I was saying something like, oh, yeah, because you're not one of those guys that thinks if you take the thing, you become a mind chip slave to the CEO of Microsoft. Except I used all the real words. And when I got dinged for it, they played that clip of my voice saying that. I was like, well, one, I clearly disagree with that. It was a joke. I'm hamming it up. But however, the AI on the other side did not appreciate that. There's another one which was on me. I can't even fight this one, where I called then Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg a slur, which I thought was funny. YouTube did not. So that's my only two. I managed to skate otherwise, which is sort of a miracle. But returning to the kind of war between the sexes stuff. And so you obviously have this kind of rising resentment of feminism or kind of social progressive signaling among young men. Also, you have to remember, like, imagine being a teenager going through the pandemic, going through George Floyd, going through all of this. That's going to produce a reaction. And largely that's been facilitated by social media. And at the same time, you have almost a perfect mirror image reaching young women, right? They are getting the feminist narrative. They are getting, the racial justice, in scare quotes, narrative. And again, like, I've not necessarily experienced a ton of this because, I'm part of a, conservative religious community. That's where I met my wife. We've known each other forever. But it's hit women incredibly, incredibly hard. So for instance, my wife doesn't vote. She doesn't believe in voting. She just doesn't do it, right? It's not like I told her not to, but even before we were together, she just didn't do it. And she will tell this story where one of her then friends basically said, you're not a woman if you don't vote in this election. That was deemed to be sort of synonymous. And so in much the same way that black doesn't literally mean of African descent. So for instance, Joe Biden said, if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. And people laughed at him because that's obviously not true. But that capital B black is a political identity. It means more than just the color of your skin. So Clarence Thomas isn't black because, and people have said this, because he doesn't ascribe to that political identity. And so for Generation Z, largely speaking, man and woman have become political identities, right? There's baggage associated with it. And again, social media has enabled many, many things which are not explicit political signals to become implicit ones. So for instance, I deleted all of my quote unquote, normal social media in 2020. Because basically it was like, I'm just hating everyone that I know because I'm seeing their insane political ramblings. And, rationally, there's nothing about deleting social media that is a political act. But that was a signifier that I was a wrong thinker because I didn't want to be seeing the truth, which was, the mainstream narrative on COVID and on George Floyd. That was a signifier. You're like, oh, what? That's weird. But there are dozens of other things like that. Like your, whatever your vices are, your taste in music, your, like, all of these little things have become signifiers of, these broad political camps. And so in addition to, this loneliness epidemic that we often talk about, there is also this sort of political war between the sexes that is horrible. Like, genuinely, it's a bad thing for the human species to have taken male and female and turned those into, in many cases, rival political blocs. And so you certainly, as I've said earlier when talking about Generation Z, have the economic situation, which is dire. Like, it's really bad for any number of reasons. But you also have what, people kind of derisively refer to as the dating discourse, right? Why aren't people pairing up? And you see this both in the data on marriages, but even down to, the number of people who've, gone on dates in the last year, let alone had sex in the last year. It's like, okay, like, sure, those aren't great proxies for, whatever XYZ thing we want to be happening. But at a very fundamental level, men and women are not interacting. They're not talking to each other. They're not pair bonding. And so, to be honest, I think that's behind a lot of it as well, which is that, many young men feel locked out of, economic advancement and also locked out of social advancement, right? Like, I can't meet a girl, or, I can't meet a girl who's not, to be honest, kind of crazy. And again, that doesn't absolve any one person of personal agency. Like, you need your, and this is sort of what we got into on my show. Like, you exist in the time you do, you need to make certain decisions that, even if your hand of cards is not particularly good. But I think that that's another big part of it. And you see this, and oftentimes these posts become viral because they are sort of a certain amount of confirmation bias. Like, oh, I hate the boomers so much, this is what they say. And who knows how, representative they are. But you'll hear something like, oh, I don't know why young men aren't just, approaching a random girl who works at a gas station. And it's like, well, we kind of see that, and that's a specific example, right? But you kind of see at once two different things there, which is one, I would get arrested if I did that. Like genuinely, like not I personally, but like that is a very real fear that either, in the court of public opinion, and there are a great number of these viral videos of women, recording themselves interacting with a guy saying, look at this creep, here's his face, or also, right, the legal repercussions. But also it's sort of revealing because it's like, oh, you grew up in a time where working at a gas station was just a thing that normal people did. Like you could be assured that's just some, girl from like the local college or whatever working in her free time. It's like, and I'm sorry if you're a gas station worker listening to this, I'm not trying to disparage you, but like now that is like an underclass job, mostly for immigrants. So like even that, that hypothetical situation, it's like you kind of see that perfect mix of not only have the relations between the sexes changed, but the economics have dramatically changed. And so, look, I get it. Like some part of this is simply a function of getting older. Your point of reference becomes more and more distant. But I think at a very fundamental level, and I'm ruder to the boomers on this show than I normally have been, there's a failure to recognize that things may have gotten worse in aggregate, even if they have gotten better for you personally. And, again, right, like that incredible increase in the relative value of a home, if you're already in, that's great for you. You have this massive store of equity, basically due to, currency debasement and, a few other trends, but still like you have this huge asset. And it's entirely reasonable for you to want to cash out, collect that value. I get it. But fundamentally, the interests of young guys like me and people looking to cash out and retire are diametrically opposed. I mean, I own a house, so like I, was able to kind of beat the odds on that due to, some factors we don't need to get into. But like, even setting aside my personal interest, it's like, well, you've got a whole bunch of guys who are basically trying to get started, who are trying to establish themselves, who are up against, relatively speaking, a 2 to 3x increase in underlying asset valuation, where there has been not even simply a freezing of average compensation in real terms, a decrease, right? So you're kind of getting screwed on both sides of the equation. And it's like, well, yeah, of course there's going to be some anger and some resentment there. Does that mean that all of that resentment is correct in every specific instance? Does it mean that it's directed correctly? No, those are separate questions. But if we're talking about that disconnect between, younger and older people, I think that's a large part of it, is that many older people view the system as having worked fundamentally. Like it worked for me. And if you could just put your nose to the grindstone, you could replicate what I've done. And for many younger people, they feel as if, no, I'm being screwed. This system has nothing for me. And so if I'm going to achieve what my parents or grandparents did through normal means, I'm going to have to do something extraordinary. I'm going to have to, break out of that system one way or another. And again, we're talking about very large numbers of people, but I think that fundamentally is the core of the difference. Like, is this system working or not? And you see that in politics as well. A lot has been made of the same divide on, the political right. This is a relatively recent thing. You see it on kind of the fracture point of Israel, but it applies to many other things as well. Look at the difference between, Republican staffers and the people they work for. You see this actually even in the kind of legacy GOP press. Look at figures like Rod Dreher, David French. They are freaking out about this. They say, oh, the young people aren't conservative. It's like, well, that's entirely true. They're not. Because, again, like I said, they view the system as being, if not unsalvageable, but directly contrary to their interests. You see the exact same thing on the left, where there is this difference between the kind of legacy party, the people who view the system as fundamentally working, and those who want to burn it down. Mamdani is kind of a perfect example of this, even if not him personally, then his supporters. We're basically like, well, I don't care that he's a socialist. Fix it. Make it better. I don't think that's a great answer, but just look at the polling from Mark Mitchell of Rasmussen on my show not too long ago. Really, really fascinating guy. And he's talking about the kind of rise of the burn it down politics of basically like, well, I'm getting screwed. So whatever makes this go away, I'll press that button. Like, I don't care what it's called. I don't care who does it, but fix it somehow, or at the very least, blow it up, and I'll at least have a decent chance then to make something happen. And I see a lot of, understandable angst from older people because they are very worried by that. But fundamentally, it's like, well, if you want to save this system, I don't necessarily, but something needs to change because it is becoming less and less workable for the next generation. And, someone might say like, oh, why are you complaining? Or like, why are you, so upset? It's like, well, to be honest, man, like, I'm doing fine. I'm not like wealthy by any means, like, but I was able to get married and, do some things, right? But like, that's proportionally more and more rare, the kind of what was assumed to be baseline things. Again, like I think about my grandfather, like he didn't go to college, he got out of the military, worked in McDonald's, then got a job as a mechanic, like a very normal life, but he was able to, his whole life, drive new or almost new cars, have houses, and support a family. And like, yeah, sure, these weren't like mansions. This wasn't some kind of princely affair, but the kind of basic, parts of accepting a stake in society were much more achievable. And if you have guys who don't have a stake in society, who don't have anything to lose, and also don't really have an accessible way to get a stake in society, it's like, well, eventually you're going to reach a critical mass of people who just say like, well, like, fuck it. Like, why not? And, even if the answer they select on is not, a great idea in particular, you have to understand that that is a individually, rational position to arrive at. That's probably much more than you wanted on the generational divide.
No, not at all. What is at the top of your concern right now then from the standpoint of you as an individual and for your family? What's at the top of your list? And is that what you're building your show around right now, having those types of guests because of what your top priority?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a huge part of it. I am sort of a amateur when it comes to talking about financing the economy, but it's definitely a big part of it.
Yeah, but you as an individual, not that you're an expert, but what's at the top of your mind right now?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, man, that's a huge part of it. I mean, another one which is even more basic, and you see this kind of ripping through the right, both in the UK and America, is basically like what's the point of this whole thing? Like, what's the point of America? What's the point of a nation? And so when it comes to something like immigration or even the culture war stuff, it's like, well, okay, like, do I get to have a say? Like, do I get to have a culture that is mine, that I am allowed to engage in? Or fundamentally, like, am I someone to be replaced? And so I think that that's a huge part of it, because if the point of society is simply to act as kind of a nursing home, right? Like to give the most number of people a sort of maximally comfortable existence, right? Where it's like you have all of these services done for you by who, it doesn't matter. Well, that leads to a very specific, outcome. But also, again, going back to our conversation about the power process, that leads to a complete and total erosion of meaning. That life becomes pointless. And so we briefly mentioned the IDW, and Peterson and others have sort of become parodies of themselves. But I think what shot them to the kind of stratospheric heights was addressing that that crisis of meaning. You have more and more people who are lonely, more and more people who don't have anything they feel as if they are a part of, and they feel as if their lives are pointless. Right? Why am I even here for? I don't have a family. I don't have fulfilling work. And so, at a very fundamental level, right? That crisis of meaning. Like, one, why am I personally here? But two, what is the purpose of our nation? I mean, that's huge, right? And even someone like Peterson, who I'll pick on briefly, I don't have any hate for the man, but that again was sort of
he kind of dropped off. He kind of dropped off, by the way.
Yeah, I mean, look, like obviously he had some very severe health issues, addiction to or chemical addiction to benzodiazepine, which like I wouldn't wish on my worst enemies. I don't begrudge him that,
He lives here in Phoenix, where I'm at, and I've been talking about him just in my personal life. I'm like, man, that guy just disappeared. And his daughter once in a while will pop up. His daughter's been all over X over the last couple of days. You probably have seen with the Tate stuff and it's a whole nother story. Provides for some good entertainment on these social media platforms. I mean, Milo, Milo's like the ultimate troll. I mean, that guy is the godfather of trolling. He actually trolled, not even trolled, but he made a comment to my friend Dave Collum last night, which you haven't seen. It's hilarious. Absolutely hilarious.
I mean, Milo is hilarious, but I'll be honest, I'm slightly afraid of him. Where it's like, I wouldn't trust that guy as far as I could throw him. So I have a sort of like Jane Goodall with the chimps, where it's like, I'll watch this from the bushes with glasses, but I am not getting involved.
Well, they're provocateurs, right? There's a group of them. I mean, Laura Loomer's a provocateur. I've had her on. Nick Fuentes is a provocateur. Milo's like maybe he's the original OG of provocateuring. I would say Candace Owens is a provocateur. Who am I missing there? Chris Burnett, who I'd love to actually talk to, but he's another one I think is he's done some great work, but there's this group of people that they're provocateurs, man. That's just what they do. Like,
oh yeah. It's one of those things where it's like, I can never bring myself to be morally outraged by that. Because it's like, look, man, like if you've been on the internet for long enough, it's like that role always exists, and like, if you think it's a bad thing, the worst thing you can do is give it air. Cause like, that's what it is, right? It's provocation. It's designed to get a reaction out of you. And so like, even if you look at this and you're like, oh, Candace Owens is a great, she's saying crazy stuff. It's a threat. It's like, okay, sure. I don't agree with Candace Owens. I will admit, I find her ability to sort of play Mad Libs very entertaining, where it's like, you can sort of just swap the nouns and verbs, where it's like, yes, Charlie Kirk's ghost astrally projected into my third eye and told me that he was Catholic. It's not 100% a retelling of something she said recently, but it's pretty close. Like, I get it. It's entertaining. But if people are kind of morally offended by that, it's like, it's the oldest bit of advice on the internet, like, don't feed the trolls. And at a certain point, much like woke media, it's like, if you hate it, but you won't stop talking about it, like, dude, this is kind of on you.
Yeah, who's the asshole here? Who's the asshole here? The person that's putting it out there or the one that's watching it?
Yeah, exactly. And I even like I said, I'm not morally offended by this stuff. I see a great many people who are, and it's always like, all right, dude, maybe just don't, you don't have to read it. To quote, was it Tyler the Creator or some other rapper who said, how can you be cyberbullied? Just close your eyes. It's kind of my take on a lot of that as well. It's like,
but some of it's so good, man. Like, some of it is so entertaining. Yeah. You can't help it. I mean, I'm sorry that people go through whatever, but like some of the drama, but they also create it and they live their lives on these platforms. So all of a sudden when it gets exposed, what do you expect? Like Elijah Schaffer. I mean, I watched that whole thing with him and Sarah Stock and Milo again. Like, what do you expect? I mean,
yes, 100%. Where it's like, you sort of live by the sword, die by the sword. Which is part of the reason why I never talk about drama on my show. It's superstitious, but my thought is, if I don't talk about it, it can't affect me. We'll see how that experiment works out.
So I'm sorry, we were talking about Jordan Peterson. I was just saying how.
Oh no.
He literally, he lives here. I believe his daughter lives here, and the guy just has completely disappeared.
Yeah, well, I mean, and as far as big issues, I mean, honestly, I think that he was fundamentally correct talking about that crisis of purpose, crisis of meaning. Because, again, like, for many people, they feel as if their lives are completely and totally pointless. You see this a massive explosion in deaths of despair. Whether it's opioids, whether it's self-inflicted, a gunshot wound, alcoholism, and that speaks of a society that's fundamentally very sick, right? People who feel as if there's nothing justifying their existence. And when you combine that with this kind of epidemic of loneliness, right? We're like, okay, well, something's deeply, deeply wrong. And like, there's a part of that that's, political. There's part of it that's spiritual as well. But to me, it's sort of a, microcosm of a broader crisis of meaning, across the West, where you have these cultures, you have these nations that can't really justify their own existence anymore. They believe, and many people believe, that these nations, these peoples are irredeemably sinful. Right? They have done something wrong and they don't really deserve to exist anymore. And see the same thing with many people. And it's like, well, no, I like these things. I like these peoples. I want them to continue to exist. They're a good thing. They're a force for good, as someone might say. And so, if you believe that that project is in crisis, it's like, well, one, all right, dude, there's your purpose. That's a huge thing to do. Whether that is your literal bloodline, your culture, your nation, whatever it is. Like that's an anecdote to that purposelessness. But also, like there are a great number of, and this has been kind of proven, right, in the recent DOJ files, right? There's a great deal of like genuine evil in the world, right? I mean, as we've seen the Epstein files, perhaps darker than we ever could have imagined. And so to me, it's sort of like, well, there is your anecdote to purposelessness, right? There's all of a sudden this grand adventure, right? To save your people, to save your bloodline, all of this. And also, right, like there's a clear enemy in that. And so it's why I do consider myself in a certain way to be kind of a, like a political partisan, not in any way, not in any violent sense, of course, but like that is something to throw yourself into. That is a thing to dedicate your life to. And again, right, this is one of the things that I think is very interesting. And it doesn't have to be explicitly political. In fact, many of the people doing this are not political at all, and they're better for it. But one of the things that was interesting about the pandemic is that it was a massive sorting event. And I noticed this in my immediate peer group. I saw it in others as well, that it sort of caused a split. And it was basically who is going to be normal and who's going to go along with this. And those two populations over time have produced dramatically different results, right? The kind of normal population, which I guess in a statistical sense is not, because it was a dissident thing, but historically normal. It's like, okay, well, those people are doing things people have normally done. Right? They're starting families, they're building relationships, they're doing what you would expect. And that population who hasn't has sort of, to be honest, kind of devolved. They live in this sort of extended adolescence, kind of effectively pointless lives of consumption, where, they may have their hobbies and activities, but really not much of consequence is done. And I think that is sort of an expression of exactly that, which I'm talking about, where it's like, that dissent, that break from the kind of mainstream norm is basically what is required to be a human, not in a biological sense, of course, but to do the things that mankind has traditionally done, which seems to, again, going back to our conversation about the power process, have that synthesis of accountability and meaning, which prevents either explicitly or effectively ending your life. Like, okay, sure, you may not have, suck-started a shotgun, but like if you're, an aging, cat lady who does nothing but, feed her animals, buy things on Netflix or buy things on Amazon and watch Netflix, it's like, well, functionally, from a biological perspective, you're dead. Like you did not pass through that filter. And so maybe I'm speaking vaguely here, Mike, but I think that like that is what is to be done. And that is sort of that anecdote, as Peterson would say, that anecdote to chaos, that anecdote to meaninglessness. And really, I see that is what's happening, is that you have a great number of people who are looking for a meaning, looking for a reason to exist. And you see this, I think it was Real Clear just did a poll about this. One of my buddies sent it in talking about how the return to religiosity is being driven by effectively Gen Z men. And you could look at that as basically a crying out for meaning, crying out for like, why am I here? What am I supposed to do? And you could look at, the rise of, left-wing activism among women, which we spoke about earlier, as sort of a xeno religion, like a xenoestrogen, right? A molecule that your body thinks is a hormone. And so it bonds onto it. It's like, well, left-wing politics aren't really a religion. It doesn't have to be left-wing politics, but politics aren't really a religion. They don't quite fulfill the same role. They don't do the same things for you, much like whatever chemical from your shampoo doesn't actually do what estrogen does in your body. Well, but it's close enough, right? You'll latch onto that because that does provide you with a narrative to tell yourself about the world, right? I am an advocate for Palestine for a little bit. Now it's immigrants. It'll probably be some drug dealer who got ventilated by the police, and 3 months from now it cycles through. But again, is a narrative, is something to tell about yourself, why you exist, what you should do, what is your place in the world. And fundamentally, and it's actually sort of fortuitous we mentioned Campbell earlier, because humans are mimetic, right? They tell themselves stories. They place themselves in a narrative. I mean, this is why we have such a visceral emotional connection to stories that are hundreds, if not thousands of years old, right? Like you read Homer and you're like, okay, some of the language is a little archaic. I don't 100% understand what's going on, but you're like, all right, I get this. It resonates on a deep kind of brainstem level, because even if you aren't literally Achilles, it's like, well, that's a story I can sink into. It explains, I can imagine myself as that, or I can relate to that in a certain way. And fundamentally, right, there's a large group of people who find themselves with either no narrative or a very weak one, where it's like, well, I guess my narrative is that I am irredeemably sinful because of my, my culture, my skin color, my religion, whatever. And I guess that just means I'm bad forever. And the one thing I can do is sort of empty consumption, hitting a certain number of, serotonin receptors. And that's supposed to give my life purpose and meaning. And very clearly that is not working. And so I think what you see is people casting around for an answer to that. Whether that's a literal religion, a xeno religion, there is a great need for that. And one more thing, and I'm sorry, I'll get off this soapbox, but you oftentimes see older people and conservatives making fun of the kind of weird theater kids who post neo pronouns, right? The Zer types on social media.
I don't even know what that is. Look, I don't even know what that is. Educate me on
like
that.
Neo pronouns are all the like really ridiculous. Like I'm not a he, she, or I'm not a they. I've made up my own, like Zer.
Oh.
And they get increasingly more fractal and ridiculous to the point where it's like literally no human has ever uttered this combination of syllables. But I guess if I don't say that, you're going to report me to HR. Who am I joking? None of these people have jobs. But in that, right, there is something on its face completely and totally ridiculous. Like you called yourself a demi boy and you dress like a kid from a 90s Sears catalog. Like, what is this? And it is ridiculous on its face. But from my perspective, what that is it's a desire for meaning. It's a desire for identity. What am I? I don't feel as if there's any answer to that question. So I guess I will just have to construct for myself this kind of cobbled together brand affiliations and personal aesthetic and pronoun to create some sort of identity for myself. And it's sort of tragic because historically that is not where people derived their identity from. It was, from their nation, their people, the institutions they surrounded themselves with. And this is sort of elegantly explained in Putnam's Bowling Alone, right? The death of these sort of civic institutions, these places where people made friends, met their spouse, derived a sense of purpose from, right? These institutions required something of, their members. And So generations later, it's no shock that people are searching for identity, and many of them come up with really retarded ones. Like, yeah, sure, you can laugh at them, and you should, but that speaks to that kind of wider crisis that you see in all the other examples I've mentioned. So yeah, that's kind of my, I guess, rambling, unorganized thoughts on it, Mike.
You talking about 2020 and that divider. That's what, you look at that period where there was a clear line, right, between what people thought they were absolutists on both sides, right? But also now, as we've gone 6 years later, especially on the right, where I thought, in my own experience, being objective is what we should have taken from that time period of what, questioning everything. And when I say objective, I mean questioning everything and asking, why, and not being afraid to speak. But, it's like on the left is still, I don't know if they even know there's a left or right. Kevin Deanna's got me thinking differently now after I talked to him the other day.
Dude, isn't he? He's so smart, man. I think Kevin's like the coolest guy in the world.
So smart. It's the first time I ever spoke with him before. I've had Jared Taylor on a few times, and Peter and Lydia Brimlow over at VDare, and but yeah, that guy, talk about. He said you should come on Identity Politics. I'm like, man, that's way out of my league. You guys are all way out of my league. Like I'm like a club fighter going in the ring with like Manny Pacquiao. I don't have the hand speed or the footwork to keep up with you guys. But anyway, this idea of being an absolutist, and now further on the right, it's like there's more dividers. Middle East, huge divider, right? MAGA versus people asking questions, huge divider. So it's like it's being cut and cut and cut and cut. And the only conclusion I can take from that, because I get heat on both sides, as probably you do as well. Because I think I'm objective. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe you might get a sense. Maybe I'm not. Maybe I'm totally, biased in my own absolutist world. But I feel like if you are an absolutist, then you're in a cult where you think this is the way it is. This is the way it's going to be. And I don't know. That's not what I want. I kind of went off on my own rant there.
No, not at all. So I think that this is sort of a function of mass and scale. There's a great quip from Yarvin where he says, success is having your own ideas explained to you by the stupidest person you've ever met. And all right, it's kind of funny, right? But obviously with anything, as an idea becomes more and more popular, it sort of becomes a parody of itself. You see this actually, and oh boy, am I going to make the Catholics mad with this one. But you kind of see this with the Catholic Church, right? Where it's like if you're a 130 IQ autist and you want to get really into, Thomistic law and all that, you can. That exists. You can deep dive into that. And that's Catholicism. But also, Catholicism is like, when like a Mexican lady lights a candle with a picture of a saint on it, and that's about as much she gets from it. I'm not trying to pick on Mexicans, but you know what I mean? There's that simple kind of peasant version of it. And okay, that's one thing for the church, but you see the same thing with any idea, right? That there's the sort of vanguard, whatever form it takes, that is interrogating ideas, has a nuanced version of it, and when expanded to a mass, it gets necessarily dumbed down and turned into a series of slogans, right? It becomes a meme, right? That kind of infectious idea, which has almost no place for nuance. It is catchy and spreadable and short, right? It's the difference between Nietzsche was like the nihilism man. Nothing, God is dead, nothing matters. That kind of like quick kind of thumbnail view versus like, actually reading about the distinction between, the Apollonian, the Dionysian, or whatever, the kind of real meat of it. And so that's kind of the attitude I always take towards kind of any feedback or comments or anything. I'm still quite small, so I'm relatively speaking still within my own bubble, excuse me. But every once in a while something gets picked up and it kind of goes outside of that. And so you have people attacking you, sloganeering at you. And that's always the thing you have to remember, which is like, look, like most people don't understand the most complicated version of an idea, right? They get the kind of quick and dirty version and they go with that. And that being, incorrect or incomplete doesn't discredit the kind of core of it. You saw this 10 years ago with all the like SJW destroyed content, right? Where it's like, well, I can debate a, 18-year-old college freshman. It's like, sure you can, man, but like, dude, I could find, an
It's an
18-year-old
old
college
act.
freshman.
That's an old act now, man. That's
Yeah.
such an old, like, sorry.
But you see that same thing where it's like you're attacking the lowest version of a meme, the lowest version of an idea, because it's cheap heat, right? It's easy to do. You're crushing cans, right? To take a boxing analogy.
And clicks. You get the clicks and yeah.
Oh, 100%. There's money in it. But to me, I think that a large function of that kind of like totalizing instinct is coming from that, right? Is coming from, you're getting the lowest resolution idea. And, also, I think that fundamentally any system of belief becomes totalizing because it is making a claim about the nature of reality, right? A very fundamental claim. And so within one broad, kind of meta political claim, you can have conversations on, the merits of something, right? So for instance, like if you and I are both, Christians, we can, go to the Bible and, quote it back and forth. Although that even gets messy. Like if you and I are both Lutherans or both, Baptists or whatever, we have a common frame of reference. And this is part of the reason why I think these like religion debates are so mind-endingly agonizing, is it's like, okay, well, if I'm quoting the Bible and you're quoting like the Bhagavad Gita or whatever, we can't have a discussion there because fundamentally we're operating off of these different, ultimately unprovable claims about the nature of reality, right? Like I can't prove to you physically that Christ raised from the dead, and you can't prove to me, as this hypothetical Hindu, I don't know enough about Hinduism to even know what claim they would make. Cows are sacred? We'll go with that, right? That is fundamentally improvable. And so what I think, again, with that kind of totalizing instinct is that politics is fractured to the place where that common ground has gone away. They're operating under fundamentally different meta-political narratives. What is the purpose of life? Even down to something like, what is a man? What is a woman? And so without that common ground, it's Hindus and Christians, right? They're working on fundamentally different, axioms. And so that, I think that's a big part of the reason why debate culture has kind of died out. Like you still see some of it, but it's really not anywhere near, the kind of high cultural prominence it used to be. Because, to be honest, it seems as if many people have realized that it's ultimately futile. And also you see this in politics as well, right? Like people are more and more, even on the legislative level, abandoning the pretense of appealing to everybody, right? Abandoning the pretense of like, oh, well, my opponent across the stage from me, we disagree about a great many things, but we both want, a bright future for America. It's like that still exists. And like, if you're from like, I'm going to say Iowa, I don't actually know that much about Iowa, so that may be a profoundly ignorant statement. Like in the kind of more historically normal parts of the country. But like fundamentally, politics, the culture war, and they're kind of one and the same, have become a war of belief, right? A war between those mutually incompatible memes. And so I think that's another reason, and this is, I guess, something we went into in our last conversation, so forgive me if you're bored hearing me repeat myself. But I think that's another part of the reason why we see that sort of totalizing that you're describing, that totalizing behavior. And also, here's another example, that cultural dissolution I spoke about earlier, where the meaning, the institutions, the responsibilities that created meaning, as those have gone away, politics has stepped into their place. So my friend Aaron McIntyre wrote a book, The Total State, which is about exactly this. It's a very good book. I've read it. You should too. But he makes a point that many others have made, that for total politics, total control by the state, this kind of tyranny, there can be no rivals. So in the Roman context, right, they had to smash the old families for the empire to be born. Like if you have this sort of, familial kind of mafia organization that runs the state, well, you can't have an empire in that at the same time. Or, you can't have, the church and, the revolutionary government, right? So as those institutions have fallen apart, both due to deliberate action and just lack of interest, the state has stepped in. So going back to kind of the sexual revolution, right? All of the institutions you had around family formation, as those broke apart, well, the government steps in. So now you have divorce court, you have CPS, you have all of these things which exist to take up the slack, but also that's now a new way that politics affects your life. Because if you're in government, now you get to dictate the rules of all of those different things. You have created an entry, you've taken something from the apolitical, because I mean, let's be honest, right? Like, can you imagine talking to like a farmer from 1800 about like family politics? It's like, what does that even mean? I guess I vote because I own property. Like, it's sort of beyond the scope of politics, right? Well, that enters into the political arena. And as more and more stuff gets dragged into that, well, one, everything becomes political. And two, the total amount of power the state has grows and grows and grows. Because now the state doesn't just get to decide, if you get, like frog marched into a frontline battalion in a war. Well, they also get to decide, do you have custody of your kids? They also get to decide, any number of things. You mentioned HR, like, let's be honest, that's sort of an arm of the state, plus or minus. And so I think that that's another part of it as well, right? That is why politics is totalizing, because more and more, I mean, even down to, the relationship between parents and children, the relationship between, husbands and wives have entered into the realm of politics. You see what I'm getting at there, Mike?
Last question, how do you feel about the future for you as an individual and as our society, as a country, both in the short term and the long term?
Yeah, so I often get characterized as someone who's, black pilling, right? Because, I frankly look at
Kevin said bleak pilled, which I thought I'd never heard that before. Have you heard that?
That is true about Kevin, actually. The world's most black-pilled man.
Well, he said bleak. He said bleak pilled, not black.
Yeah, well,
bleak
that's what I'm saying. Yeah, it's an accurate term. I love Kevin. I won't get off on that. But point is, that is almost all of that analysis is true. There are things that are going badly, like very badly. You can look at any number of social criminal trends over the last 60 years and say this is not going great. Fair enough. I agree with that. But fundamentally, I look at the dissident movement, the resistance, whatever you want to call it, as being in the ascendant. Right? We have answers for these problems to questions that many are not even asking. I see this in a couple different ways. One of my buddies, Thomas, he talks about this because he deals with many of these same issues. And he said, look, man, I've been in this for longer than you've been alive. And when I started out, you were the biggest deal in the world if you had a physical newsletter with 100 people subscribed to it. That meant you were a big deal. You were important. Like, look, man, if you have like 100 listeners on your podcast, no one cares. There's nothing. And look, like I'm not saying that if you were a podcaster with 100 listeners, you should neck yourself. Not my point at all. But to say like that scope has increased. But also, like within the political groups I'm affiliated with, the conferences I'm going to, not only are they growing in terms of numbers, but also the quality of people is rapidly expanding. I went to the Old Glory Club OGC conference in Tennessee last year. I've been 3 times now, 3 years in a row. And there was a marked difference from year 2 to year 3 that I went there. Not to say the guys there before weren't good guys, not at all, but I was meeting more and more guys who were capable, like competent people with something to lose. A guy who's in his 40s, working in tech in one of those big tech cities, pulling down a whole lot of money. And he basically says, like, look, man, like things aren't going well. And I think I need to do something about it. Like I feel compelled for the sake of my family. It's like, okay, good. Like not good that that's happening to you, not good that we're in this situation, but like that's a strong sign. When people who are serious people, who have something to lose, who have something from a certain perspective better that they could be doing, that's a leading indicator. You see this as well, like, and I won't name any names, but like, as I'm sure you're aware, Michael, you can see people's names and emails on Substack. And, every once in a while you get an email and you're like, hey, I know that name. So you Google it and you're like, oh, shoot, that's actually that guy. Why is he here? Because you don't just default to our weird corner of the internet, right? That speaks of something. And so generally speaking, like in the mid to long term, I think we're going to win. Like the short to medium term is likely not going to be pleasant. But I look at even my friends in South Africa, the guys at AfriForum, the guys at Irania, and I see a country that is way, way worse than we are now, right? They don't have power. They don't have roads, horrific crime. And yet there is still that kind of light there. Like they're building something, they're making something. They made their own university out of scratch. It's like, okay, that's real. Like that's something. Even in these kind of horrible circumstances on paper, it's like, well, that is like, there's something redemptive in that, right? That is, again, a calling. Like you can do it. Look at these guys who had it worse than you, or in a worse situation. They were able to make something worth preserving. And I think that is incredibly white pilling from the perspective of like, okay, like something can be done. Like there is a way to beat this kind of cultural degradation. And also, like, again, that I think that is very much kind of an antidote, to that kind of crisis of meaning. And so when it comes to the short to medium term, like on any issue, you're like, oh, do you think this is going to get better or worse? It's like, oh, dude, it's going to get way worse. Like, if present trends continue, like, you could look at something as stupid as like driving down the road and not being hit by a guy who doesn't know how to drive in an 18-wheeler. It's like, well, that's probably going to get worse. Like that seems to be, given current trends, the demographics, crime, any one of these. It's like, okay, well, yeah, I accept that analysis. But the idea that, things are going to get worse soon and they will stay worse forever, I fundamentally disagree with. And again, it's because, I see, so many young guys who are discontented, who feel as if they're being screwed and are taking the appropriate measures, who are organizing, who are building, networks of like-minded individuals, who are building things, whether business or political institutions, who are basically saying like, no, okay, like this sucks. I'm going to fix it. Like I am going to make it better. And I think that attitude is exactly what's needed. And there's a great segment in, Nick Land's Cracker Factory in the book Dark Enlightenment, which I think I've referenced like 4 times in the last week because it keeps coming up, where he talks about how for, Western Anglos in particular, that the default mode of conflict resolution is secession. It's basically like, all right, I lost. I'll go start my own thing. You see that all across America, right? Like the formation of Rhode Island, even, where it's basically like, oh, shoot, we lost that fight. We have our own thing now. And you see that cultural idea carried through obviously the American Civil War, but also even into something like white flight, right? Well, it's like, oh, I guess I'll start a suburb somewhere. Like I don't want to be a part of this thing anymore. And it's understandable, but eventually you reach a wall, right? You can't run any further. And if I can close on this, it reminds me of a great essay translated in English or written, I can't quite remember, by my buddy Ernst Van Zyl, Conscious Caracal, member of the team in AfriForum, where he talked about the importance of digging a trench. And he was basically saying, he's like, look, like when you retreat, you don't retreat to run away forever. You retreat to make a defensible position. You retreat so that you have time to dig a trench. You have something to defend. And that essay was incredibly impactful in my life. It's actually not a huge, it was at almost the exact time decided to start a podcast, decided to get involved in this, eventually to put out my face and make this what I do. And I was walking around downtown Richmond. They were tearing down the monuments, and I was listening to this, walking down Monument Avenue. The Lee statue was still up, ritually defaced, covered in graffiti. And I was walking past, believe it was Davis. It might have been the admiral whose name I can't remember. But looking at these just holes in the ground where the symbol of a culture had been dug out and replaced with just a pit of mud. Listening to him read this, listening to talking about retreating to find something defensible, I was like, God damn it, he's right. And so, yeah, look, things are going to get worse. Like, all of the available metrics, at least the ones I'm seeing, things are going to get worse. But fundamentally, I view us, our guys, whoever it is listening to this, is like containing the seeds of a regeneration, a renaissance of something that could actually fix this. And I might be wrong, I might, be overly romantic in that. But to me, like, I see that as being an immense white pill, right? A case for hope. And look, like, if it doesn't work, if this project all turns to dust, well, look, man, it's better than watching Netflix and blowing your brains out, I guess. Like, at the very least, it is a meaning to your life, which is, I think, even if it is ultimately unsuccessful, there's sort of a heroism in a doomed cause. And I don't think our cause is doomed.
It's in talking to you now for over 90 minutes and, my friend Matt Smith, I don't know if you follow him and his son Maxim with the book, The Preparation, that they put out back a few months ago. You should talk to Matt on your show. Maxim too.
Yeah, I'll check that out.
They wrote a book, Matt, Maxim and Doug Casey wrote a book called The Preparation, and it's a path that they carved out for Matt's son Max, and you can follow him on Substack, and it's a really good book, which I'll let those guys go into detail with you if you decide to have them on. But Ben Kelleran I've had on here. Will has been on now a couple of times. Make sure I'm not missing anybody here. I don't want to forget anybody. I think that's it. But talking to you guys is, I'm going to group you here for a second, because it does provide me with a practical approach, provide a practical approach on where we're at and working within the system the best that you can. And it's great to hear, and so I appreciate you, taking time to come on.
Sure thing, man. Thank you so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it. While I'm thinking about this, you should talk to my buddy Johan Kurz.
I'm talking to him. I'm actually talking to him the first week in March. First week in March he'll be on my show. He was on awesome. With Matt. He was on with Matt Smith and Doug Casey.
Yeah, I'm not surprised. They're working on a very similar project. But Johan's book is fantastic. I liked it so much. I got given a copy by him. I gave that away. I bought 4 more copies and given them out. That's how much I like it. But he's another person who is in a much more intelligent, well-expressed way, looking at the same issues that I am, and similarly has decided to actually do something about it. So for those wondering, like, oh, what should I do? Johan Kurz, Leaving the Legacy. That'll be my shill. Check that book out. But there are many minds devoted to this problem, and like Kurz, many others, many serious people who could be, making lots of money and not thinking about this, who've decided that this issue is worth their time.
Where can people find you?
So you can find me, The Jay Burden Show, on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you want to listen to podcasts. I similarly have a free and premium feed. The premium feed's on Patreon, Substack, or Gumroad. It's like $5 a month. It's pretty cheap. Helps me support this project, get the episodes early and ad-free, but you get all the same content. So you don't have to feel like you're missing out on the free feed. But again, Mike, thank you so much for having me on, man. This was a ton of fun.
For those that, have not supported Jack and his show, The Jay Burden Show, I think after listening to him for 90 minutes, it gives you, if you didn't have a reason then, you have a reason now. And support what he's doing. And it's important. And I thank you. And I hope this is the first of many conversations ahead. I'll be the host. You be the guest.
Yeah, sure thing, man. I'll have to come back on. This was a ton of fun.
Mic drop. Jay Burden, thanks for coming back, man.
Yeah, man. It's good to see you again. I'm glad to be back.
Appreciate you taking the time. We were just talking offline for a minute, and talking about Johann Kurtz, which you mentioned him last time when you and I spoke, and it's incredible that I had Will Tanner on yesterday. Got to speak with Johann. Had you on before, and now you're back. And man, I'm just so appreciative that you guys make time for me. So thanks.
Oh yeah, of course. I'm happy to be here. I'm always somewhat cautious to be mentioned in the same sentence as Johann and Will, who are extremely well spoken and genteel, and I will put out at least 1 to 2 episodes a week with a dick joke in it. So, it's I'm surrounded by better men. Yeah, man. It's funny, and I don't know if I mentioned this to Johann, but I've given out like 3 or 4 copies of his book. I like it. I just bought a bundle of them off Amazon. And actually I still have 1 more copy. I just haven't had time to give it to the guy I think he'd be good for. The point is, yeah, what can you say about that guy? He's very, very talented, and I've got to catch up on that episode. I have, after he and I spoke last, which is probably 6 months ago, I haven't been in touch, and that's something I need to fix because, yeah, as you've said, great guy and very, very well spoken, which is a commendable trait.
Well, and also with that, I was talking to somebody in the gym last week, and he was, I'm going to be 48 next month, and this guy was, if I had to guess, was older than me, and he was ripping on younger people, which you hear this stuff, and so I'm like, and I was we're specifically referencing my conversations with both Will and you that I was having this week, and I said, I got to tell you, the younger people, some of the ones I talk to, they're not clueless, they're not dumb, they're not stupid. And you know what? They're taking their own initiative. They don't want to go the corporate route. They don't want to go to the traditional. And you know what? I don't blame them. I wish I would have been that age to recognize it because I hated it. I hated college. No offense to people that go, but I hated corporate, sitting at a desk all day long. So I have a lot of optimism and hope, and I hate that word, for your people in your age, the Gen Zs.
Yeah, well, I think on that, like that guy, I don't know what his specific complaints were or who he was talking about. But look, like we understand that, wisdom and experience is something you get with age. And so, you definitely see younger guys sort of falling into, well-traveled pitfalls, right? So on one hand, you get it. But at the same time, we got to understand that, like, we're talking about a large group of people. And like that talented top 10%, well, it's always a minority, right? So if we're talking about the largest groups, right, a whole generation, especially one where, you still have, and I'm a little fuzzy on this, but you still have kids in high school, right, who are part of that generation. It's like, well, you're probably not wrong. Like, sure, I'm 100% sure that, 99 out of 100 19-year-olds are morons. I certainly was. But at the same time, right, we've got to understand, one, who are we talking about? Because like in a culture like America that's incredibly fractured and diverse in both the positive and negative sense of that, it's like, well, who are you talking about, man? Because like, I know a bunch of guys in, the homeschool space. A guy I was talking to this morning at the gym. And, he's got a 12-year-old that, works jobs with him. Like it helps his dad out as a contractor, knows how to put, shingles up and do all that kind of stuff. And it's like, okay, well, that's an incredibly capable young man, well above his years. So like, if we're talking about that group versus anyone else, it's like, I understand the appeal. And you see the same thing with boomers, right? People love to throw it around. But, if we're going to be adults, we have to talk about groups. I understand that. But at the same time, it's like any statement is inaccurate on that level, on a personal level. And we spoke about this last time. And actually, this is funny because this sort of connects to our eventual topic, right? Which is this war in Iran, which is there is a sharp generational divide in America. And as we said last time, I really think that is, to what degree has the system ever really worked for you? And sure, there are people like Harry Sisson or whatever, the DNC twink that people are always making fun of. Like that guy's bought and paid for, right? He probably makes a lot of money. directly or indirectly from his activism. Like you'll never see him be anything other than that. But I think for a lot of people, that kind of college to corporate path is either not an option or so unappealing of an option that you're sort of forced to go elsewhere. It's funny, I think last time I was speaking to you about, my immediate peer group. And, one of my best friends, a guy I lived with for a long time before I got married, he and I were talking, and, I'll give no biographical detail on that, but he's the guy who sort of threaded the needle, right? Went to a good school, good grades, scholarship, got into a, relatively lucrative corporate job, and he's leaving. He's got a large, runway in front of him, again, to do something else, because the institutions like that, even if you can sort of, as I've said, thread the needle, and we've certainly mentioned before, the racial discrimination angle, the weird gender politics of the workplace, which are very much felt in corporate America, but also one of the weird transitions, and you see this at all, many different industries, is that particularly over the last 5 years, there's been a move away from training people. And you see this anytime someone's complaining about looking for jobs, right? Where it's like the bare minimum entry-level position says 2 to 5 years experience. And okay, maybe is some of that because they're positions they're not even looking to fill, or it's one of those, well, we don't really need this, but if someone comes in who's massively overqualified, we'll take them. Or is it, part of the kind of, like ethnic rackets that we found out about, with different hiring practices, the whole ongoing, H-1B scandal, that all may be part of it. But fundamentally, a lot of these institutions are not interested in developing people, right? They would much rather find someone that someone else has paid to develop and then bring them in at the kind of middle level. And so, okay, sure. Sometimes people are able to, like my friend, kind of, shoot the gap. If you're unusually competent, you're right place, right time, you're able to get thrown into a position that is expecting a lot of you and you're able to rise to that. That 100% exists. But that creates a very weird culture of there is nobody under a certain age and no one without, a certain number of kind of years in that institution. And so one of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of companies, because we've been talking about, not you and I personally, but people, this problem with how different industries are graying, right? They have a relatively small number of highly competent people nearing retirement who know how XYZ works. The power grid, the water treatment plant or whatever, and they are retiring. That knowledge is being lost with them. Well, at least what I'm seeing, and there are articles on this, you can certainly find them if you search, where companies have basically started to make the gamble that, well, what if we just pay that guy 2x his working rate to sit in a cubicle for a year and a half and dump all of his knowledge into an AI? That will solve the problem. Now, we don't know if it will or not. I'm perhaps a little skeptical, but that corporate route is, even if you can make it in the door, very difficult to advance up the level, because you have a large number of people who are, by virtue of the sort of entry requirements, ahead of you, and also sort of bought into that institution. And so my buddy and others have basically been like, you know what, like, I don't want to be behind this big glut of people who are 10 to 15 years above me forever. I'll have to wait until they retire to ever rise above a certain level. The whole population pyramid is really distorted due to, a whole number of different things. And also, so point is, all of that is not just me complaining about the job market. It's to say that, again, these sort of trends and forces that push people out don't tend to only push them out along one vector. Finally, bringing it back to, the Iran war, we're seeing a very sharp divide. I think it was New York Times, I'm not entirely sure, it was a prestige outlet, forgive me for not having a citation to hand, that broke down opinions on Israel, favorable or unfavorable, by demographic. As you would expect, more Republicans like Israel than Democrats. That goes back to Carter and Reagan. Don't need to get into that. but the divide on age is rather sharp. And they put it at 50. Basically, the majority of self-described Republicans have unfavorable views of Israel. It's a pretty dramatic majority. It's nearing 60%. Obviously, when you count that 50 plus, which is the majority of the Republican Party, of course, so it's, more heavily weighted, that shifts. And this is what I've seen anecdotally, is that my friends and peers, and sure, some of them are like me, political nutcases, but most aren't. They're just kind of normal guys, are, by the standards of the ADL, extremely anti-Semitic. And is that personal, right? Are they going to their accountant's house with a burning cross? No, not at all. It's not that sort of quote-unquote anti-Semitism. It is to put it mildly, an aversion to our relationship to the state of Israel. And one of the long-term struggles of the Republican Party, first we saw the sort of MAGA revolution, right? And the problem with that, from sort of a political view, is that it's sort of a cult of personality, right? It's tied up in one man, Donald Trump. And look, like if you study your history, you understand this is a repeat thing, right? Movements tend to be led by one man. But, just given the kind of limitations of current American politics, at some point, Donald Trump is not going to be around anymore. He's either going to retire or he's going to pass away. He's, an old man. So the question was always, well, what becomes of this project after him, right? What becomes of MAGA, or this kind of marriage of MAGA and the Republican Party? And one of the really, shall we say, interesting dynamics in 24 was that men under 30 swung hard for Trump. Right? In certain states, they were, the deciding factor. It's been 2 years. Forgive me, I don't remember all my electoral maps, but this was a well-reported upon, feature of that election, and it was recognized by Democrats to such a degree that they started dumping a lot of money into it. Right? Harry Sisson, others, these kind of like MAGA, or not MAGA, sorry, like DNC, TikTok influencers who, I'm not on TikTok, I don't understand it, but I see some bleed over. But also, you may remember that rather. How would you say this kindly? Rather well-built Hispanic woman that the DNC brought in as their sort of like, ambassador to young men. She was going around to like, frat parties and things like that. It went about as well as you would imagine. So it was incompetent, but at the very least, there was a reaction. There was a recognition that this group has shifted. If we, assume normal trends, that people tend to become more conservative as they age. If this group is already, a strong leader for, a strong, supporter of the GOP, that will create problems. We need to head that off. And that erstwhile effort was not successful. Quite simply, just due to, the last 10 years of, kind of like woke racial guilt politics, this sort of extreme misandry. It wasn't really working, but, and it's not just this, but it is a part of it. This sort of slavish devotion to the state of Israel has really alienated those people. And okay, sure, in many cases, is it, the most erudite kind of John J. Mearsheimer, breaking down, the power politics? No, it's gut level, it's instinctual, it's wrong in certain, provable factual instances. But people feel as if they were sold America first. They were sold, fixing our domestic problems. And what they got was a bunch of court cases, things got wrapped up by the judiciary, which, okay, fair enough, isn't necessarily the president or the Republican Party's fault per se, and a huge shift to effectively neocon foreign wars. Right? Time is a flat circle. It's 2006 all over again. Nothing has changed. And when you won, effectively as a protest candidate, as someone who said everything that's going on now, whether it's, and a lot of it was the domestic excesses of the woke left, the trans kids, the BLM stuff, the feeling that we have a demented old man at the head of this country, throwing out, insane policies. Well, I want that to stop. And Trump came in with a large group of kind of disparate people. You can think of, Kennedy, the kind of podcast circuit, all of these people who aren't necessarily natural Republicans, per se, to borrow a phrase from Reagan. Well, okay, sure, that was going to be difficult to keep together, but seemingly every single one of those secondary issues has fallen by the wayside for foreign policy. And sure, foreign policy doesn't necessarily matter a ton in elections directly, right? It doesn't matter. Like, to be honest, I think most people, especially most right-leaning people, are relatively ambivalent on this war. But the problem is the perception, if we can use that term, that this is the highest priority, right? This is the actual purpose of everything. Because all of those other secondary priorities have bent for this one foreign, ally, quote unquote.
Jay, let me interrupt you for a second. No, it's okay. Because I want to ask you something. As you've just explained, from a political standpoint, how do you feel watching this war unfold? Like, you as a married, and as a husband, as a young man, what are your thoughts on it?
Well, look, so I just want to, from the very beginning, say this is a very difficult war to get any information on. We don't have any embedded reporters, and everyone is lying.
The propaganda, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you out. The propaganda is wild right now. Did you see that video going around this morning? The Lego video?
Oh, no, I didn't.
Oh, I should have sent it to you before. It's another one of these. You've seen a few of them. They've been putting them out periodically.
Yeah.
There was another one that came out. I don't know, maybe it was last night, but I saw it first thing this morning when I got up. And it's another one of the Trump-Israel. It's wild. It's like 2 minutes long. I mean, I don't know who's making these things. They claim it's from Iran, but who knows? But to your point,
right,
you don't know where this is coming from and who's putting it out. And
right. So there is, as you probably garnered from this discussion so far, I'm not the biggest fan of the State of Israel or the Likud party. But I want to be cautious because there is a pattern of sort of crowing over the defeat of the American military and of Israel that is not necessarily honest. So, for instance, you have things like actually this raid to save a downed pilot, which we don't really know anything about. But the tweet that went around was,
can I
yes.
Sorry, that makes no sense to me. I haven't talked about this on here yet. From what I understand, and I could be wrong, that he hiked 7,000 feet after crashing a plane on a broken leg. Now, I've hiked 3,000 feet before. I'm not as fit as a pilot, but I also didn't crash a plane before I did it. And 3,000 feet, I went from 9,500 to 12,500 on a mountain in Arizona. It's hard. 1,000 feet is hard. And these are well-traveled trails that I was on. Very populated, groomed for hiking. So I'm having a hard time buying the story about this pilot. 7,000 feet, crashing a plane. 3,000 feet, so that's a hard hike. Sorry.
No, not at all. And there's a point to what you're saying. I'm not the guy to talk to on that. I've not done a ton of research. I'm merely using this as sort of a prop, if you will, to explore this point where it's like, look, like from the like maximally anti-Israel, anti-American position, you have people saying like, oh, you idiots, this plane got shot down. All the planes of America are getting shot down, and how they wasted all this money to go grab a guy. I mean, man, I don't know. It seems like this war isn't going great just from the perspective of, well, are people clamoring to take credit or are they looking to blame other people? It seems as if they're looking to attribute blame, which just from a human behavior standpoint indicates to me this isn't some sort of soaring success. But at the same time, like, look, like we're fighting a real country with real air defenses and a real government. Like, do I think that's good? No. But on balance, it seems as if our planes are doing relatively well. They're not raining out of the sky like it's, footage from World War II. So I want to admit that like not all of the coverage we are seeing is honest or true or fairly sees what we're fairly portrays what is possibly, because again, that's the other part. We don't really have sort of a divine, like a plumb line on this. But I will say, big picture, what I'm feeling is sort of what I joked about earlier, right? Time is a flat circle. Like this, decade and a half process to kick the neocons out, to get away from the conservatism, the governance of George W. Bush has failed, or at least it's deeply, deeply imperiled. Because look, like the anti-war coalition wasn't the biggest part of MAGA, but you can trace a direct line from anti-Bush to the Tea Party to the roots of MAGA. It was people who basically said, I want a government run for my benefit, an America first government. And when government officials, Rubio, Trump himself, and others have basically said, well, Israel sort of forced us into this, right? We didn't want to do it, but the exact reason why, but they basically, put down an ultimatum. And so we felt like we had to. Well, that doesn't feel like an America first government, right? That feels as if the priorities of a foreign nation, rank higher than, domestic ones. That naturally rankles people. You see this as well in the response to, the Joe Kent resignation. I assume everyone's heard about it. Basically, Joe Kent, leader of some office in DNI for counterterrorism, resigned, basically said, I can no longer continue with this war. Seems as if, Israel got us into this. And okay, you can believe him, you cannot believe him. You can think Joe Kent is a rat bastard. You can think he's an American hero. Realistically, does that matter? Right? He's a minor DNI official from an office that before now, like, I guarantee you, neither you nor I knew about or could name you another director of that position, right? But the response from the sort of Zionist-aligned media is telling. You have Alan Dershowitz, noted massage enthusiast, freaking out, like absolutely losing his mind. In this piece on Substack you can read where he calls, Joe Kent, an anti-Semite, Jew-hating, neo-Nazi Nazi lover. And you're like, well, okay, man, he didn't say anything about Jews at all. He didn't, use ugly or abusive racial language. I haven't really heard any stories about, Joe Kent making an extracurricular trip down to Argentina to, hang out with some 100-year-old guys. To me, that seems unhinged. It seems insane. And when you're seeing it from other figures like Mark Levin, who's been heavily boosted by the president a number of times, effectively frothing at the mouth, calling for blood, it seems kind of insane. And it seems especially insane when you're like, wait a minute, well, why don't you care this much about my stuff? The stuff that I voted for you to do as a citizen of this country first and foremost, right? That seems as if that's the deal. And look, I'm not ideological about this. I understand corruption is sort of a fact of a fact of political organization, period. Our leaders are, ultimately, human, and, they have their moral failings. But it seems as if a request for the leaders of my country to be primarily concerned with the running of my country, that seems kind of reasonable. I'm not even asking for you to be this sort of like wise philosopher king, just to care more about me than some other country. And when you combine that with, the fact that another big reason that Trump was elected is because, Biden's economy was awful. It felt hopeless. It felt as if, everyone was kind of, losing, people were getting poorer. And not only has the economy not gotten better, but the results of this war have made it worse, right? The Strait of Hormuz might or might not be open right now. It's sort of unclear. We're in the middle of this like bizarre, maybe ceasefire, maybe not. Again, the reporting on this has been really difficult. But fundamentally, when you sort of run on a like, I'll make everything stop sucking so much, and you do things that materially make people's lives harder. For instance, we've all seen gas prices shoot up. Well, okay, does, the lady who works at the local Cracker Barrel, does she care about the fact that the new Ayatollah may or may not be gay? Or does she even know what the IRGC is? Probably not. She doesn't care. And if she voted for Donald Trump, it was to make things better. And when things are getting worse, and things aren't getting worse due to, for instance, a freak hurricane or just, the way that the global economy is going, but because of an active choice to do something you promised not to on behalf of a foreign alleged ally, you start to look around and you're like, wait a minute, what was the point, right? What was the reason that I colored in that little bubble? And so I think for many people, it feels as if, right, we tried to do what we were supposed to do, right? Vote the bums out. And very similar thing happened in 2016, albeit, at sort of a lower level of amplitude. And at least the first time around, you could kind of look at it and say, you know what? Well, they tried all this stuff. They tried to impeach him. They kept him tied down. So he couldn't do all that stuff. And they hated him so much, they cheated to get him out. If you believe that, I happen to. But so there was a story there. There was something that you could say, well, you know what? This is why pulling the lever didn't do what it was supposed to. And I think what makes this one particularly cruel is for that first 6 months to a year, it seemed as if it was working, right? We had Doge going around, draining the swamp, right? Getting rid of all this fraud. And sure, there were this kind of flurry of executive orders and judicial stays going back and forth, but it felt as if something was happening, right? They were making a good effort of it. And then, naturally the momentum starts to slow. Fair enough. You had Operation Midnight Hammer, which made a lot of splash on Twitter. I don't think it really mattered for real people because it was so short and it was like, okay, I guess we blew up their nuclear program. Who knows either way, right? Whatever. Okay. But then when it feels as if that momentum, that positive sentiment has run out, you're dealing with like real domestic issues and the entire focus has shifted to the exact sort of foreign policy that 10 years ago, Donald Trump was criticizing, right? He was making fun of the other Republican candidates in 2015 in a way that shot him to popularity, right? Making fun of Jeb Bush. You can go back to the tweets where he was criticizing Obama. And so to me, even aside from how well is this war going? Are we, kicking ass and taking names? Are we kicking ass, taking names, and then creating further problems? Is it a debacle? Who knows? But I think that the real problem, and the real problem for a lot of people, and the reason that you see support from young men just absolutely disintegrating, right? In the raw aggregate, I believe Trump's under 30 approval on his first day in office was -1, which, okay, that's still negative, but compare that to other Republican presidents, right? That's a win. It's now deep into the double digits negative, right? Very, very unpopular. And so
do you go alongside with that, Jay? I mean, and if you don't mind me asking, and I think I asked you before, how old are you?
Yeah, I am 26. So I'm
26.
right at the top end of Gen Z.
Do you feel like you're accurate with that reading? I mean, is that how you personally feel?
I do. And as we said last time, this is heavily dependent on sex, right? Women are, especially Gen Z women, are much to the left of men. And what I also don't think is going to happen is that the Democrats are going to win young white men. They aren't, for any number of reasons. But what I think we're going to see is what we have seen time and time again, which is that conservative aligned voters just stay home, right? They don't show up. You're seeing that in kind of down ballot races across the nation. And what's frustrating to me is setting aside my feelings about this, because as I've said before, not a huge fan of the state of Israel for any number of reasons. But okay, setting that aside, the political calculation here is baffling to me on its face. Because look, like setting aside gas prices or anything else, the president had a pretty narrow gap to shoot. He's probably going to lose the House, but had a decent chance of keeping the Senate. Why does that matter? Well, one, so he doesn't just get stuck doing nothing forever, vetoing, pants on heads, retarded bills and, getting nothing done. But also, let's be honest, the Democrats want to impeach him. They've been very clear about that. And not only impeach him, but prosecute him and his friends. You've heard this rallying cry for certainly the last year, but even before that. I see no reason to disbelieve that. And so to me, that is really why the midterms matter, because, it's effectively a really decent shot of, Donald Trump being impeached and people around him facing jail time. And so, I naively assumed that people would be, if nothing else, at least self-interested enough to avoid that, right? I don't want to be impeached. I don't want to go to jail. I don't want to, be under the thumb of, figures like Letitia James, who, I believe sued him for $544 million, right? Some kind of absurd astronomical sum for, something that his accountant maybe should have gotten fined for, whatever. So point is, like, that is a very real fear, right? That is a very real consequence. And also, what we are also dealing with is shattering any chances of MAGA becoming a multi-generational product. We spoke last time about the sort of dire economic circumstances where many young people also feel as if they're getting screwed over to sort of pad the retirement of baby boomers. And when you combine that with, figures like Lindsey Graham saying, I feel as if my highest political goal is to go back to South Carolina and convince them to send their daughters and sons to die in the Middle East, you're like, well, wait a minute. I'm one of those sons. I guess currently, depending on, this is another news story. I was very difficult to verify if this age of selective service has been increased or not. Who knows? But the fact that that story went incredibly viral, and I had, my friends basically walking up to me, showing their phone, and they're like, "Is this true?" And I'm like, "I have no idea." Indicates, right, that there was a lot of anxiety around that, a lot of feeling like, "Wait a minute."
So I didn't mean to interrupt you right there, but I'm glad you bring this up because it's the automatic registration, I believe, right? Isn't that and what's the age? Do you know what the age range is on that?
At least as far as I know, currently, it is 1826, but there have been news stories. I have not verified this, so it is a rumor going around that has or will be raised to 32. Who knows if that's true or not? But the fact that I have people in my normal life, right, guys who are in that, 26 to 32 age bracket saying like, "Hey, did you see this?" I mean, to me, that indicates that people are worried about it. They feel as if like, wait a minute, am I not only getting screwed because I can't buy a house or I can't, get a decent paying job, but also now, you, Lindsey Graham, expect me to go fight some sort of ill-conceived war? And again, I don't think there will ever be another Vietnam-style draft for a whole number of different reasons. I don't think it's politically viable, but at the same time, the fact that, anecdotally, people are worried about it, people are concerned about it.
Are you, Jay?
Means that...
Are you worried about it?
Personally, no, because I genuinely don't think there will be another draft for a number of reasons. I also don't think a land invasion of Iran is just geographically possible. Like, it would be very difficult for us to do that. And so I could be wrong. I hope I'm right. But to me, I view that as more of kind of a leading indicator of generally felt anxiety, right? Of feeling like, wait a minute, I'm getting set up for something else that's going to screw me over. And I think that's the feeling of a lot of people of like, not only did everything stay the same, right? Did it just continue to be kind of shitty? But now this, right? You're adding another thing onto it. And at least from what I've seen, like, I don't see a lot of guys saying like, all right, great, time to get out my Che Guevara t-shirt. They're just, much like we were talking about with the corporate world, looking at, the political system, being like, well, what can I even do? Right? It seems as if there's no place for me, because really it seems as if, and this may be the lesson of both, Ukraine and Israel, it's that, you're allowed some leeway domestically, but on the foreign policy front, it's always John McCain, right? No matter what you do, you're always going to be, funding some foreign war, at the very least, if not, sending people to, kill and die there. And look, like, I'm not, and I get this feeling as well, kind of, emotionally opposed to war as a concept. Like, there are certainly guys in the anti-war movement who view every war as illegitimate. I don't, I'm not some sort of peacenik. But to me, and I think the thing that galls a lot of guys is it's like, well, this is so transparently not in our interest. This is so transparently not even our idea. So, for instance, right, you have the lead Iranian negotiator, in kind of back channel talks trying to get this thing wound down. And he and his wife get killed in Pakistan by an Israeli strike. And you're like, well, wait a minute, aren't you guys supposed to be our friends? Right? Why are you killing the guys we're trying to talk to? Or similarly, right, this kind of weird, abortive, maybe a ceasefire, maybe not, where, Israel just continued striking Lebanon, after we had sort of done some sort of deal. And look, don't get me wrong, it seems as if the Pakistanis kind of screwed the pooch on that one. Like there was a big miscommunication, but nonetheless, right, it's sort of like that, if you've ever seen it like at a bar where it's, a guy, kind of a big dude and his tiny little girlfriend, and she starts picking fights, and now he's the guy who has to sort of sort this out afterwards, the kind of drug sorority girl. But like, that feels as if the situation we're in, where it's like, well, we're not the ones making these decisions, but we're on the hook for it, right? You have, again, Israeli officials confirming that, IDF soldiers will not participate in a ground invasion of Iran. Again, I think that a ground invasion of Iran is fairly unlikely, but I also would have said that, unilateral out of the blue assassination of the Ayatollah was unlikely. So, may not be your guy for predicting things. But I think that if we can really drill down to it, the problem is not necessarily the particular, vagaries of foreign policy, but it's that general feeling of, oh, I'm getting screwed and you guys are compromised. Now, I'm not saying, this is Epstein stuff or whatever, but like, you are not acting in my best interest. You have a higher priority that isn't me, that isn't even America. It's those guys over there. And that's really frustrating to people. And so, you have figures even as, kind of, diverse as guys like, Theo Vaughn and Tim Dillon, who look, aren't intellectuals, but they do have big audiences and they're widely listened to, saying things along that line, right? Saying things that like, it basically seems as if, this whole MAGA America First thing was a giant scam. I mean, the Epstein stuff is another great example, right? Another instance where people felt like, I have this burning desire to fix this. Like, we don't do that anymore. That's not what we are. And sure, we got way more documents, albeit, it was done very differently than we were led to believe, but still we got a bunch of documents out. And again, it feels as if, we were promised transparency and we got more cover up. We were promised America first and we got Israel first. And look, like, I don't irrationally hate Donald Trump. I don't have TDS. I'm not sort of morally offended by the kind of boorish or, slightly uncouth things he says. In general, I think they're pretty funny. I still think he's funny. But it's like, look, man, like, this was conditional for me. I gave you support because there was a patronage element here. It was a quid pro quo. And that's why Donald Trump shot to popularity, particularly with his most devoted, group. Because normal working class white Americans had been for a long time promised a lot and given very little, right? They had been promised these kind of vagaries about, either Christian values or, how trickle-down economics would finally hit them.
Tariff checks.
And
don't forget about the tariff checks, Jay.
Yeah, tariff checks. I mean, that's another great example. But particularly the Democrats had wasted white working class support. People like my grandpa who'd been Democrats their whole life until Donald Trump showed up, because they weren't big business people, but they realized they had sort of been replaced. That the Democrats weren't interested in white working class people anymore. They were interested in the Obama sort of rainbow coalition. And when Trump came in and was basically like, hey, I'm going to do things for you. I'm going to, add some protectionist policies, bring manufacturing home. Okay, fair enough. You promised me something. And did people get all of those? No, but they sort of got like a little bit of like a psychic patronage, right? Well, he's smashing the libs. He's, making fun of the people I hate on TV. And fair enough. And lots of those people will be loyal to him for that till the day he dies. He could do anything. But for a lot of other people, particularly in 24, it sort of felt as if like, well, geez, I'm getting screwed. You're offering me something. And even if I get 1 out of 10 of these crazy promises, well, you know what? It's something. And the idea, and I think this is why, many people are sort of feeling more and more insulted by this, is that like, you have the terms for people like us, right? It's like, oh, you're a panicking, you've tuned out, you're insufficiently loyal. Why have you abandoned ship? It's like, look, man, like
that is so high school. That is so high school. Like,
yeah, it's also like, this isn't a marriage, man. Like I didn't sign a contract. It was conditional, right? It was this for that.
I see people putting this out on X. People that are older and I'm not going to mention them because I don't want to give them any attention. But they're doing this whole testing loyalty. This is a loyalty test, and I'm just like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? This is not high school. What are we doing here? Well, because I question, to your point of what you've just explained, over the last 40 minutes, because you question things and how you're not seeing benefit from it. Now all of a sudden you're disloyal. Stupid.
No, 100%.
Sorry to mean.
And it's one of those. No, not at all. You're completely right, Mike. And it's one of those things where, like, look, like I caught a lot of flack early on in the Trump presidency for saying we owe this guy some loyalty. We owe him the benefit of the doubt, and so
give him a chance.
100%. And like, I'll be honest, watching a guy take a bullet or nearly take a bullet, like that worked on me. Fair enough. And so I'm not coming to this position out of some irrational hatred for the man, or coming to this position because I'm so motivated by, hate for Israel or hatred of Jews, as Mark Levin would put it, that I just am chomping at the bit. And anything that nothing would be good enough for me. Far from it. But it's sort of a rational actor here, right? Who believes that I call balls and strikes. At a certain point, it's like, well, look, this isn't in my interest, right? You're wasting your political capital. You're wasting your attention doing this for someone else, not for me. So like, yeah, sure. I'm not exactly hoping that, the mullahs, kill, 70,000 American servicemen. I don't want that to happen. But like the idea that I have to get screwed over and then, clap for it, I have to say like, yes, sir, may I have another? It's like, look, man, like this didn't work for the other guy. It's not working for you. This is not some sort of like undying blood oath to President Trump. And you know what? If tomorrow he said, you know what, we're done. This is stupid. Let's go back home. Fair enough. Great. Awesome. Still a stupid decision to get involved in the first place. But like, we need to be done with this. And however that happens, I'm fine with it, to be perfectly honest. And, in the future, if he's the one who gets rid of, directly or indirectly, birthright citizenship, great, awesome. There are some things that we got rid of through him that I thought we never would. And so, on balance, you have to consider that a point in his favor. And I'm never going to diminish that. But at a certain point, it's like, you've got to understand, right? There is no relationship in politics that is unconditional and, eternal like that, especially, given exactly why he, sort of rose to prominence. I will also say that as we go to the generational divide, we're seeing this more and more strongly, right? That I am not alone in these feelings, that many people under a certain age. Did I mention last time I was on here, I can't remember, the comments Ben Shapiro made about the war in Iran?
If you do, I don't recall. Please share.
So fair enough.
And then I want to ask you. I want to ask you something else about the draft too. But go ahead.
Sure. Ben Shapiro has sort of continued in a trend we have seen since really the 2024 election, which is a deliberate desire to inject a wedge between older and younger Republicans. So you may remember the series of leaks that have come out of, young Republicans chats, all of these sort of, youth institutions where, different figures have come in and said, oh, the kids in these chats, they're saying naughty things, kick them out, denounce them, get rid of them. Similarly, again, at Heritage, right, where it was, find the unbeliever. Oh, this Catholic kid wouldn't go to Shabbat dinner. There must be something wrong with him. The leader of, Heritage basically, first defended, Tucker Carlson over talking to, I believe, Daryl Cooper. Maybe it was Nick Fuentes. I can't remember either one. And then, was forced to apologize for that. And we've seen this sort of growing moral panic on the kind of neoconservative right over groypers, quote unquote. For those who aren't familiar, this is a sort of semi-derogatory term, although they embrace it, for fans of Nick Fuentes, basically saying that, the young people are poisoned. You need to cut them off.
Have you met him, Jay? Do you know him?
I've not met him, no. But point is, the idea is poisoning the well, right? Anyone who is under a certain age and anyone who is, not on board with the sort of, maximal neocon version of Republican politics, well, they are a groyper, which is basically just a shorthand for a Nazi, and you need to cut them out, right? Not my beliefs, the beliefs of people who espouse this. You've seen this coming from the sort of like, more explicitly kind of neoconservative wing, but also from the kind of like former liberals, figures like James Lindsay's and others, basically saying like, watch out for these guys, don't let them in. And so what Ben Shapiro said is a very clever elision, where he was talking about a report from, I believe, the Manhattan Institute that said 53% of Republicans under, I think it was 47, arbitrarily picked, I assume, don't believe the Holocaust narrative as, reported by historians, basically saying that over half of these people are Holocaust deniers. Isn't that awful? And explicitly connected that fact to low support for the Iranian war, right? The idea is, you don't support the Iranian war, you are a Holocaust denier. And then very quickly afterwards made an allusion to what he and many others, this is a point, I've seen from Lindsay and Mark Levin. And when I'm using these guys' names, I'm partially doing it because they're ridiculous and they're fun to make fun of. But also you've got to understand that these are both, widely read figures. And for every one I'm mentioning, there's another 50, right, who were sort of in that nexus.
Douglas Murray.
He says,
Douglas Murray.
Oh, yeah, man. I have no legally advisable opinions about Douglas Murray. I will leave it at that. Which, by the way, do you remember a while back when he said that no one was allowed to write an article on a country they hadn't been to?
Yeah.
Given what I know of Douglas Murray's sexual history, I'm going to go ahead and bet he has not been to Iran. I'll leave it at that. They tend to, view.
No, there's no coincidences. There's no coincidences with things anymore. There's no such thing as a coincidence.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to chime in there, but
no, not at all. So he goes from saying, young Republican men don't support the war in Iran. They're probably Holocaust deniers, to talking about the rise of what he calls grievance politics. And this is another particularly insidious part of this argument, which has been, widely shared, which is basically the idea that, if you object to this, you are engaging in grievance politics, which is, you believe that all the problems in your life are caused by other people. You're not accepting responsibility because you have grievances, ill-defined. So it's basically, not only are you a Nazi Holocaust denier for not supporting this war, you're also basically the woke left. Right? Young people are Nazi woke left. And this is being amplified to people of a certain generation, and it's not working on all of them. It's not what I'm trying to say at all. But to say that narrative, right, the idea that the young people are unsavable, you need to cut them out, that they're, the worst of the worst, is furthering that generational divide, that problem of succession that, MAGA Incorporated had, where it was already a tough road to hoe, given the, the economy, given the affordability crisis, given this war. But the fact that all that same time, you have these figures saying, yes, they're irredeemably bad, they're horrible, they need to be cut out, they need to be shunned from these institutions. Well, that means that the problem doesn't just apply at, the voter level. Well, what happens to all of these institutions, right? What happens at Heritage? What happens at the Daily Wire? What happens at any number of, these sort of conservative institutions. Because from what I've heard, and I have multiple sources on this same fight is raging down the middle of all of these, right? People who feel as if, they're American nationalists first and foremost, and people who feel as if we have this eternal special connection to the nation of Israel. And that's the sort of proximate reason. We understand there are other issues going on there at once. Like that's a huge gulf to bridge, right? That's how are you going to, continue this, force in politics on when you have kneecapped, you have literally, pulled the ladder up behind you and say no one else can come up. Well, and forgive me if this is a real long time to get to this point, Mike, but to me it seems as if we're going to see the same logical conclusion we saw in the corporate world hit politics, where basically, there is no way for me. There is no place for me to go. And I understand when I say no, I don't mean all. There are guys right now who are in their early 20s in the corporate world. If you're listening to this, I'm sorry. That sucks. And similarly, there are those same guys, writing, speeches for different, Republican congressmen and, reading through legal documents. I will also say, I'm sorry. So we're not talking universally, but it seems as if the logical conclusion is to explore alternatives, right? To find other places to go. And, big picture, right? If we're talking about these sort of talented, driven young men, it is incredibly foolish of leaders to abandon those guys. Because look, like one, obviously they will become, leaders of another generation. But also, right, we have to understand that like those guys just don't stop existing because you have kicked them out of Heritage or kicked them out of, your local Young Republicans group. If they were, talented and driven enough to get there, that energy doesn't go away. And do some guys get ruined when they're canceled? 100%. They're sad stories, although it seems to be working less and less. But like that's how you create real, genuine political instability, right? Both on the level of there are no solutions available to you. Red or blue, you're still getting screwed no matter what. Oh, you want to get a normal job and put your head down? You can't do that either. You want to work in politics and change it? You can't do that either. These guys don't just go away. They don't just disappear when you fired them from your office. And, a lot of the fear mongering over, the kind of Kuipers and stuff like that, I think is a realization of exactly that there is a large untapped well of energy that is not particularly friendly with you. And you've seen this in the religious world. That's a conversation for another day, a very similar dynamic of, young people significantly to the right of, either their literal or spiritual elders, that is creating problems. And I think that there's this desire to simply, stick your head in the sand, to look and say, we're doing great. The war's going great. The economy's going great. I have this video on Facebook of this, bright young conservative man, Berlin Hollyhand, seems to have been sort of, grown in a vat. Everything is fine. No, it's not fine.
Is that the Turning Point, the new face of Turning Point, that kid?
I don't think so. He was auditioning for it. He was sort of squeezed out of a tube suspiciously soon after Charlie Kirk's death. That's I think he was making a run of it.
And people are all making fun of him. Every one of his posts, people are just crucifying him.
This may surprise you, Mike. He said no when I asked him for an interview. Now, is that because I have made a number of derogatory comments about his sexuality, his looks, and his name on the internet? Possibly. I thought it would be a funny interview. He didn't agree. So the point is, right? Like,
did he respond? Did he respond to it? Did he even respond to you?
Yes, he did, and he said no.
Just said no. No reasoning.
The reasoning I could sort of fill in on my own. Yeah. The point is, in all seriousness, right? I think that, there is a desire, particularly, and I think that this will change after midterms when, certain realities become apparent. That, things are not going great and things are likely to continue in a negative direction unless changes are made. And those changes are entirely within the remit of people in power. It is possible to, in an immediate sense, fix these issues But that would require an uncomfortable rearrangement of loyalty. And I don't know if anyone is willing to have that. And until that happens, these trends will continue. They are not imaginary. They are not a product of grievance politics, of, idiot young people who've never worked a day in their life, who want everything handed to them for free. These are real grievances. All of the problems with affordability that I mentioned last time, the incredible amount of wealth it takes to live as, my own lower middle class grandparents did, right? Literally a McDonald's manager and a lady who worked at a bank, right? People feel that. And that is not going to go away simply because you've called them woke, simply because you've called them a Nazi. And this is something that, we on the right, we're all too eager to point out on the nominal woke left. But when it comes to something that people in power care about, when it comes to one of their sacred cows, it comes right back around. And so to sort of tie a bow on this, what are my feelings on the Iran war? One, it doesn't seem to be going great just on a military level, right? Iran is still there. We got rid of the mullahs. Israel seems to be getting, if not, battered, at least, a bloody nose from this, right? They're taking real shells or real shelling. We maybe haven't lost a lot of people, but we certainly lost more than we needed to. And ultimately, the sort of military, situation on the ground doesn't really matter, because this is exacerbated a widening political divide that I view as basically the sort of iceberg that sinks the Titanic of MAGA. Because again, and I don't say this out of joy, but we are fast approaching the 50th percentile mark of, baby boomer mortality, right? That rate will be increasing at an astronomical rate. And sure, fair enough, I understand, Gen X is one of the most conservative voting blocks in America, but buddy, there aren't a lot of you, at least compared to the boomers. And the millennials, another large generation, have, one, do not like Israel in aggregate as well. And so the idea that we can simply keep running the George W. Bush playbook, like, that's not a functional option. Maybe once, but after that, like, who are you selling that to? Who are you selling that to? And again, we have to understand that both for our politicians and for us, there are very real consequences to this. Another Biden-level migration surge, that changes how things go in the country. If all of MAGA is in jail, which, okay, sure, is, I realize, not a definite possibility, but the Democrats at least seem to be saying that. That's a real consequence for them. And so to me, to watch, a moment of incredible political capital, a moment where so much good could have been done, squandered, and for what, it really bothers me. And it bothers a lot of people. And it's really a frustrating situation. I'll leave it at that, Mike.
You get time for one more question? Have you considered, if they do change that range of the draft to, say, upwards of 32, have you considered that at all? And what would you do if that occurred?
Oh, I mean, maybe this is an overly fatalistic view on it, but to me, at least personally, like, I probably just do what my grandparents did and just, bite the bullet and at least, see if, like, enlist or get a commission. It's better than waiting for the number. And honestly, it's like, even a horribly unjust war, and I view this war as horrible and unjust. It's like, well, you know what? Like, ultimately, the little people, you and I, Mike, are not always in a position to, make decisions on that level. And so, you know what? If I have to, I have to. I'm not particularly looking forward to that. Particularly, it's worrisome, and I've had this conversation with my friends as well. If you dig into the data on what percentage of Generation Z is actually fit to serve, it's very low.
I would guess that. I would guess it would be low.
Yeah. Mental instability and obesity. And you know what? Fair enough. Maybe you're getting Ozempic shots in your MREs, and so that problem goes away. But you start to kind of run the math, and you're like, all right, even on the top end of that age bracket, I am definitely in the top blah 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 percent by like body fat, and yeah, I'm probably getting screwed, aren't I? So anyway, I mean, I view it as a pretty unlikely situation, but if it has to happen, either I get blown up, which is not ideal, but if you're enough of a religious extremist, you kind of know where you're going. Or alternately, it seems like a necessary part of being a good writer is having some horrific war experience. So, what, maybe grand scheme of things, it's not the worst thing that could happen.
I know we're running out of time here, but I do want to give you a chance if you want to talk about your show and some of the stuff you're working on, and what can we expect from the Jay Burden Show?
Yeah, sure thing, man. So, as we've said before, the Jay Burden Show is my interview show. Put out 5 shows a week. I've sort of been limiting myself on Iran war news because it is really depressing. And if I have to talk about it more than a certain amount a week, I will go insane. But I had an episode not too long ago with Ron Dodson where we spoke about the Iranian nuclear program. So talking about the sort of 5 stages of a nuclear program, right, going from the ability to enrich uranium for medical usage all the way up to the really scary stuff, intercontinental ballistic missiles. That's interesting if you're looking at the stated justification for this war, right? We had to stop the mullahs from getting nukes, from turning themselves into a sort of a Pyongyang in the Middle East. I highly recommend that. As far as what's coming up, I have Alex Petkis of Cost and Glory on to resume a series about the life of Caesar and the Roman Civil War. And then what else do I have coming out? Yeah, that's what I think I've got, in the hopper immediately. I have no set structure for what my shows are. They're an hour long, but I'll be honest, I'm a little bit ADHD. So we'll jump from, politics, history, philosophy, what movies I've seen. And then every once in a while, my buddy Carl will come on and we'll just talk about literally anything. I did a show all about cars where all we did was look at Bring a Trailer for like an hour and a half. It was a great episode.
That's great.
It wasn't about anything.
Okay, so what's the last question? This will be fast. What's the last movie you saw?
Yeah. The last movie I reviewed for the podcast was actually Elite Squad, Tropa de Elite. I watched that maybe 3 weeks ago, and then did an episode on it just due to scheduling conflict. But before that, I watched, I can't remember if it was Hail Caesar rewatched or The Year of the Dragon, 1985. I did a review with Pete Quinones. Great movie. Honestly, a pretty good episode. So yeah, those are the last couple of films I've seen.
I gotta listen to that with Pete. Pete and I are friends, and we both have a love of movies. And so I'll share with you real quick if you got a second.
Yeah.
Well, Matt Bracken, my friend Matt Bracken, set me on a trajectory 6 months ago to watch a few movies. So he said, go see F1, but before you do that, see Ford versus Ferrari, which I had never seen either one of them. Great movies. And then he sent me on the path of watching these Clint Eastwood spaghetti westerns. Have you ever seen those?
Yeah, a few of them, yeah.
Fistful of dollars for a few dollars more, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. You got to watch them in order, because Sergio Leone and Clint Eastwood, Sergio Leone did all 3, and he had no money for the first one. So if you watch them in order, you see the budget gets bigger and bigger, and The Good, Bad, and the Ugly is a classic. So then he says, when you get through those 3, go watch Once Upon a Time in the West. That's Sergio Leone's 4th movie. Clint Eastwood wasn't in it. It's a masterpiece. It's a brilliant, beautiful film. So I watched that, and then I recently watched V for Vendetta, which I had never seen before, and One Battle After Another I just saw.
Yeah, my brother-in-law saw One Battle After Another, did not give it glowing reviews, but yeah, I need to check out. I honestly, going through the spaghetti westerns would be great. I've been on a run of American crime movies with my buddy Andrew Edwards, but he's kind of a selfish prick, and he had a baby, and so had to do some stuff around it instead of talking with a stranger on the internet about movies for an hour. So no, in all seriousness, I'm glad for him to be doing that. And when he comes back, I think we're gonna do Unforgiven. We've got a whole bunch set up. Point is, the reason I'm doing movie reviews is because if I talk about politics every day, I will go crazy.
Where's on you?
And yeah, it's much preferable.
What's on your American crime list then? What's movies that you're going to review for American crime?
Oh, let me pull this
Off
up.
the top of your head.
Give me a second.
No, it's okay.
I have the list from Andrew Edwards. Which, by the way, Andrew Edwards' book, he has two. The first one, King of Dogs, and then the second one, Crowbar. Really, really fascinating. He's a great guy. You guys would get along. Let me pull this up.
Well, hey, man, I get his contact if he wants to come on after. I'd love to talk to him.
Oh yeah, he's super interesting. Yeah, okay. So this is the list, and some of these I've picked from already. First Blood, The Natural, Thief, No Good Thief, The Proposition, No Country for Old Men. Did an episode on that. Dead Man, Rush, The Gray Fox, Chinatown, another favorite. I actually should do a review on that with him because I love that movie.
Which one?
Breaker Morant, Collateral, Salton Sea, and Red Rock. Chinatown, it's a personal favorite of mine.
You know, it's funny. I'm an hour into it. I'm an hour and 10 minutes into it. I had never seen that. I think Matt Bracken told me to watch that too. Never saw it before. So I'm an hour and 10. So I got like an hour left of it. It's great.
Okay. Yeah. Well, here's the reason I love it. And I
didn't finish it. I didn't finish it.
We should get into this. But I worked for like a year and a half at one of the biggest car collections on the East Coast. It was primarily pre-World War II stuff. And the way this guy got started was he was from my area, bought and sold cars, moved out to LA, and then basically did high-end cars, the classic cars, for movies, television, and red carpet events. So for instance, we're talking like super high dollar, like, Duesenberg, stuff like that. He did the cars for Who Framed Roger Rabbit and also for Chinatown. And so a bunch of those cars I saw because they were in inventory. I was like, wait a minute. Again, 40 years later, right? It's like I've sat in that car. It's a piece of junk now, but it's still cool. So anyway, I love that movie for many reasons. It's not exactly an uplifting film. I won't spoil it for you. You can probably guess that from the general tone of it. But yeah, man. Anyway, I'm so sorry, Mike.
Jake,
I gotta go.
Where can people find you? Where can people find you real quick?
Oh yeah, I should. As a professional podcaster, you think I'd have this down now?
That's what I'm here for. That's what I'm here for, Jay. That's what I'm here.
Available Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. If you don't want to listen to ads because they're annoying, you throw me a few bucks a month on Patreon, Substack, or Gumroad, all under the same name. You get the episodes early and ad free. It's $5 a month for 22 to 25 hours of content a week, or a month rather. I'm not that good. 20 cents an hour. Really not a bad deal. Again, Mike, I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
Jay, as always, I appreciate you taking the time. I look forward to continuing following your work and more conversations ahead. Mic drop.
Not a